Hi, everybody. Nice that you're here for our symposium talking about Tantric poetry. I'm Julian. I'm here this term as a visiting scholar, teaching a couple of classes and doing some research. And yeah, since I'm the organizer, let's say, we'll say a few words about what we are doing here and about what you can expect today. Yeah, I said I'm Julian. I'm coming from Hamburg University, where I'm doing postdoc research at the moment, and obviously Dohas and Tantric poetry and things like this belong to my repertoire. Otherwise, I wouldn't dare to talk about it. And luckily today, I think you can have a very nice overview over different aspects that can be studied in regard to this, let's say, genre. Yeah. That is, of course, very famous among Indian and Tibetan Buddhists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one Apabhramsha song that is said to have been composed by Tilopa. So I'm going to talk about some Indian materials. Yeah, and the content of which I have not to introduce now, I guess. It will become clear by the presentation. Then following me will be first Karl Brunhölzl. Probably a couple of you know him through his activity as a very active translator. He has authored many books regarding a variety of genres, I would say. And there are probably too many to list them all. And unfortunately also, since I was actually expecting that somebody would do this kind of introduction for me, I do not have a curriculum vitae of anybody prepared like you would usually expect that. So I have to improvise a little bit. So please bear with me. But in any case, Karl will give you insight into some other aspects of Tantric poetry. He will talk about mainly songs that are said to have been written by female practitioners. And this is generally a special thing because, as you well will know, there is not too many female authors having written about Buddhist texts. And among these few, a couple of them, are found within this genre of poetic Doha writing. And so Karl will present a couple of these to us. After that, Julia Stenzel will talk. She is head of the study program here at Rangjung Yeshe. And she has also been doing, I think, a long career of research on Saraha's songs, particularly Saraha, but I think not exclusively limited to that. And as far as I know, she is also now preparing some other less known songs than this so-called People, Queen and King Doha, which many of you will know. But I think today she will talk about one aspect regarding this threefold cycle of songs attributed to him. And then finally, Klaus-Dieter Mattes will talk also about the development and history of that very same Doha that is ascribed to Saraha. Klaus-Dieter Mattes comes from Vienna. He was there the professor for the last 15. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Okay, right. It's the last term, yeah? Basically, the last year, yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. He is still the head of the department. True, right? Yeah. Yes. That I would have said, of course. Yeah. So, yeah, professor of the department for the Tibetan Studies program at the Vienna University. And of course, he is also, like the other speakers, a track record that is very difficult to reproduce on a, to do comprehensively, let's say. But it's a variety of things, let's say, also of the Indo-Tibetan genre, which has become rarer and rarer, I think. So that is to say, people who are working on the verge of Indian to Tibetan materials, such as, for instance, the Amanasikara circle. One thing, certainly, I think he was the first to ever translate this and edit the whole thing as well. Yeah. But of course, like with the other speakers, also Klaus-Dieter's interests are quite vast. Yeah. And certainly he will give you a very nice introduction to the development of this tantric song attributed to Saraha. So the procedure, as I envisioned it, is that we give our presentations. Each of us will have allocated a short time of questions, answers. We will have a short break, and then after that, the final speaker. And after this, there should be a little bit more time for some kind of Q&A session or some kind of podium discussion. I think we can try to keep it spontaneously and more or less organically, but roughly, let's say the idea is that after all of these 4 presentations, there will be a little bit of time for a general discussions and more time for question and answers for you. Yeah, so maybe I just get directly into it, yeah? Not to lose more time. So as I told you, I'm going to talk about a song ascribed to Tilopa, and my thesis regarding this Apabhramsha song is that is actually not written by Tilopa. So this I can already say to you, and you can think about that hypothesis or thesis while I present to you my findings. So just as a small side note, this manuscript that you see here is the first part of a, let's say, multi-text manuscript that contains 2 dohas and 2 commentaries, and the latter half is regarding the doha, or one part of the doha that is ascribed to Saraha, the part that we have in Apabhramsha, and that is authored by, let's say, some kind of crypto or deutero Advaya Vajra. And Klaus-Dieter, together with his with our colleague Peter Shanto, has edited and worked on that text. So I'm going to talk about an aspect, let's say, that regards the smaller and first part of the same manuscript that maybe or maybe not you will later see. We will, or possibly Klaus will also address some aspects of this codex, I suppose. Yeah. So on the nature of spontaneity and compilation in the case of Tilopa's Apabhramsha song, that is the title, and I'm going to show you a few findings regarding the nature of that scripture. So first of all, what I should talk about, we can just go to the next folio page, is the fact that, of course, Tilopa, as you will know, is a very famous character. Founder, let's say, of the short transmission lineages of Mahamudra for the Kagyupa, a very famous siddha. And of course, there has been, multiple books appearing about him, and primarily devoted to the more famous of his songs, the so-called Mahamudra Upadesha, or Gangama, the Ganges Mahamudra, where you can see that already in the title, they play with this, let's say, kind of mythological narrative of its origin, yeah, supposedly being, sung by Tilopa to his student Naropa at the Ganga River. And there is a lot being said about this, and so I found it in some sense astonishing that although he is such a famous person, that nobody ever bothered really to look at this Apabhramsha song that is actually existing in Indian language, and that supposedly is written by him. So therefore, I had this idea to compare these songs, and the findings of this comparison, including an edition that will appear relatively soon. I worked on this with a colleague of mine, Jim Reingans, who took care about the, let's say, the Tibetan aspects of that paper. So now what I'm going to talk about is, let's say, some excerpts from my findings that will be presented in that research. So as you can see, many of these things probably you will know, or a couple of books you maybe even have in your bookshelf, or at least one of those. Yeah, everybody who is interested in the siddhas knows the story. Yeah, so like I said, it's then, in some reason, it's astonishing that, even though it's existing, and there is only this other song really existing in Indian language, that nobody ever, tried to make sense of how to incorporate this into, let's say, Tilopa's famous Vita. Just as a side note. So Next slide, please. The sources I investigated or used are the following. So you see, we have this Doha Kosha. This, by the way, on the left side is Tilopa. I thought, I use a proper, Siddha picture where he is like really black, like really like properly smeared with the ashes of the Shmashana, yeah, like it's supposed to be. I like that kind of more, yeah, seems to be more authentic to me, yeah, these kind of pictures. Okay, be that as it may, this Doha Kosha, this collection of Doha lines was first edited by Bakshi in this one I forgot in 1935, where he partially provided a translation of that. And then it was re-edited again by Prabodh Chandra Bakshi in 1938, together with two other songs. One of Kanha, or the Dark Siddha, Nakpo Chöpa, however you like to call him, and the famous Saraha. All of them, by the way, transmitted in commentaries, yeah, not stand-alone songs, but all embedded in commentaries. That is also, I suppose, noteworthy to mention, because some people say that Dohas, they are not really studied. Yeah, there is not really a textual exegesis, and yet, we see that the textual evidences suggest rather the opposite to be the case. Yeah? Okay, so and as with many of these songs, they have been several times translated and discussed in various works, such as by Bayani and Jackson. But for some reason, none of them felt it necessary to consult the commentary within which these lines are actually contained, which you could, from a scientific point of view, consider, let's say, as a form of sloppiness, let's say, yeah, to say it nicely, okay? And also, one should further add that the Doha, as contained in the Tengyur, is not necessarily a very good representation of these Apabhramsha songs. So there is various, let's say, differences among these two, as I will show you in a moment, that clearly show that it was not really the case, that it is one song that was coherently and properly transmitted in its entirety, from Indian into Tibetan sources. And then finally, there is a Doha Dzö. It is a collection, the Doha Dzögyé. It is a collection, as the title says, of 8 Doha treasuries within yet another version of this song is found. And is the only collection that I could obtain in which I saw that both of these songs ascribed to Tilopa are contained. So that is a relatively important witness, which I think, besides Capstein 2015, who mentioned it once in an article, has also not really found a lot of scholarly interest or initiated interaction, let's say, among traditions and scholars. And then finally, we have the Vishama Pada Panjika, which is, like I said, also contained in Bakshi, but I listed it extra because we can see that. So this is the commentary to Saraha's Doha Kosha, and we can see that within this commentary there are various parts that have been adopted, so copied, in order to explain a Tilopa song, which already leaves a few implications, let's say, about their being independent from each other. So next slide, please. So here is the first example of how you can see how the nature of adoption and compilation actually works. So the first song says Kanda Bua Attana Indi Sahajasa Havem Sa Ala Vivandi. The first line, this is how it's read, and it is not only found, at least a part of that, in Saraha's works, but you can also see that the same line has then been adopted in this Doha Dzögyé, but with an alteration, as you can see. So this is marked by red. While the Tibetan canonical translation for this verse seems relatively correct, this Doha Dzögyé shortens the first part and then inserts Chakyat Chenpo instead Sahaja. So they change it here. They just exchange Sahaja for Mahamudra. So there you can already see that, well, I mean, what is now correct, what is of whom, and who edited their what, who knows, but it is already clear that only one of them, will be the song that actually has been sung if we let's say, accept the hypothesis that this has really been spontaneously uttered. So already in the second line, you can see the same thing. Yeah, the same phenomenon somehow appears. Sahajem bhava bhavana pucha. So you should not ask for existence or non-existence with regard to sahaja. I think this, by the way, this what looks like an instrumental ending should be probably a locative ending, and it seems that they are somewhat used interchangeably in this Doha song. Therefore, my translation within sahaja. So, and this line, as you see, it has been properly translated again in the canonical version. Lenki nötang nöme tamitri. And in the Doha Dzögye, we find the same nödang nöme, but trötang dral. So again, an alteration of the same line. It gives more or less the same meaning in the end. So if I say, okay, do not ask for existence and non-existence, or free from existence and non-existence, well, maybe it's in the end the same. So semantically not a big difference, but nevertheless you can see that the text has been altered here another time. So, and as we read on, then we see that the Doha Dzögye, besides having incorporated, let's say, some of these verses that we find in Apabhramsha into its version, it then starts to diverge heavily, and it changes its tone dramatically, and is actually not any longer in accordance with the rest of the song. So what you can see there is that they say it is the Doha Kosha of Tilopa, and we only know of one, but it is completely different besides these few adaptations of the first lines. And as we then continue to compare the Apabhramsha of Tilopa's Doha Kosha with the Tibetan canonical versions, then we see that very quickly there is lots of additions found in the canonical versions, which tells you that there was some form of evolutionary process involved here in the establishment of the canonical versions. So there was simply stuff added. Yeah, as you can see in the fourth line, which I have then called 4b. So there is just, an additional line that is simply not in the manuscript that we have. Of course, it doesn't mean that there was not maybe a version which contained it. Yeah, I mean, of course, the absence of, let's say, any evidences for this is not the same as, the evidence for that it was never existing. Of course not. But nevertheless, it should make one wonder, particularly when such phenomena seem to appear very frequently. Okay, and yeah, and then there is more examples of adoption and alteration that I want to show you. I mean, this is just, a small extract. This thing has in total 38 stanzas, and we observe these kinds of things throughout the entire poem. This is just an example, yeah, of these kinds of phenomena that we observe here. Next slide, please. So there is something very interesting now that you can see. So there is this Tibetan line, yeah, Deni Lame Gangi Tenpar Jawa Min, and so forth, for which no Apabhramsha equivalent is existing. But what you can see is that it is very, very similar to an Apabhramsha line that was collected under the so-called Saraha fragments in Bakshi's publication, which seems to be corresponding to this Tibetan version. So, and this is then, the moment where you really start to think about intertextual relations and the aspect of compilation, because it is, I suppose, not accidental that there is inserted a Tibetan line which reads fairly close to an Apabhramsha line that is actually existing in Indian language, but is not contained in this Indian Doha, but in another one. And we have several examples of such nature, not only with Saraha's Doha, but also with another Doha that is found. And this makes the point even more stronger. I will show you this example in a minute. And the same, by the way, you can not only see with the Doha lines themselves, but also with the commentary that is supposedly explaining this Doha. So you see below, I've printed that part of the commentary. And the funny thing is, it is a commentary to what is verse 13 in Saraha's Doha Kosha, but it has been added to verse 11 in Tilopa's Doha Kosha, while the commentary on verse 11 has been added at the place where the 13th stanza is. So you can see that, you know, the commentator or the scribe or whoever did there something copied something wrongly. There was a swap of folio or of lines or something happening there, where you can actually see that the commentary which was meant to be copied was inserted and put into the wrong place even. There is many reasons, we do not have to go into it, why this can happen, philologically speaking, but the point that is relatively clear here is that they did not only adopted the stanzas, but also the explanation that has been provided by a so-called Deutero Advaya Vajra. And this is also the reason that I believe that it was copied from the scribe, from the commentary that was written to Saraha's Doha Kosha, and not the other way around. Yeah. So this, let's say, swap or mistake in attribution indicates maybe that there was something wrong in the copying process. I mean, like I said, there is many things to go into and to think about in this regard, but this is, I think, a little bit too complicated to discuss this here. But in any case, there is evidences that that suggest that this was the practice. And you know, we do not find not only one instance, but we find the copying of commentary materials in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stanzas. Yeah, that this practice has been done. Next slide, please. So here's another example of what I just showed you already before. So we have Kanha's Doha Kosha on the left-hand side, which reads this line, Migyu mito kyuna mepani, and so forth. And you can see that a reading very close to that seems to have been adopted by Tilopa, or has been introduced into Tilopa's Doha Kosha. And this is, again, a part for which no Sanskrit is, or no Apabhramsha is found in the actual Doha Kosha of Tilopada, but which is only preserved in Tibetan. But again, this Tibetan line have an equivalent to an actual text that is existing in Indian language. So another example for an aspect of compilation and adoption of material. So what I imagine is that somebody had, let's say, this song of Tillopa, and I do not want to say that nothing is originally from him and that nothing in this thing is potentially from a figure that is called Tilopa, but the question is like how much? That is then the interesting question, because you can see that there seems to be a core line. And when I think about the nature of these days when these dohas were sung and spoken and taught and whatever, I suppose that usually the characteristic was that they were rather short, you know, in their origin. And this would lead to the conclusion that there maybe was a short part, or maybe 2 short parts that are really authored by a siddha, and that then in the course of time things were just added. Somebody has heard, oh, there is also this line that I have heard which belongs to this, let's add it to the collection. Somebody has a different idea, let's add it to the collection. And in the end up with a relatively long poem, and nobody really knows what comes from where and when and how. Yeah. So this, again, it doesn't mean that there is no original spontaneous utterance in these lines, but who knows which part it actually was. And this is then where you can see where the nature of literary practices in both Indian and Tibetan spheres somehow blurs our ideas of, you know, how to reconstruct really the evolutionary process that took place. I would actually also like to translate all of these things for you, but this will, you know, not leave us I will not have enough time to do this. I would like to, to go into also the linguistic details here, but this we could do on another occasion, yeah, when we have time to study languages a little bit more closely. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please. So there is also other practices of adoption. In this case, I think you can see it in case of the Tantra. Yeah. So what I could observe with many of the Dohas that there is adoption of very famous ideas that we already find in Tantric sources. And there you can see that, this practice of when something is general cultural heritage, nobody has an issue with adopting these ideas and incorporate it into their things. And this is just another aspect and layer in which compilation and adoption is taking place. So here, for instance, Jima Vissa Bakkai Vissa Patpaluta, Ima Bava Bujjai Bavayinatuta. So yeah, somebody eats poison and reverses understand their effects with the same poison. So, and this is an example for you cling to samsara, you enjoy samsara, but you do not cling to it. This famous rhetoric of transformation that we find in Tantric sources, right? And of course, then we have these very famous verses from Hevashra Tantra, which teach this. Yenaiva Vishakandena Mriyante Sarva Jantavaha Tenaiva Vishatattvagno Vishena Spotayet Visham. So precisely that spot through which somebody would die, he who knows the nature of it could reverse the effect of that poison with just that very poison. So that's a very famous idea. And we have also others where you can see, such as one of the most famous verses, which is appearing Yena Yena Hibat Yante Jantabo Raudra Karmana and so forth. Yeah, these kind of things where it says people are bound by the terrifying karma in this world, but he who takes this and knows the means, yeah, can get liberated from the chains of samsara by precisely these things that bind others to samsara. Huh? Yeah, and by the way, we find the same practices not only in this poem. I could also show you a couple of examples where the same is the case with Kanha's poem. Next slide, please, and then we are also soon done. One other small curiosity regarding authorship, that is part of the title. So we have this line, so Tilopa teaches that there's the fruit that is awareness. Probably we have to understand it like this through Saf Samvedana. So this is how you get there. And the interesting thing now is, that this is actually a line that we find in Saraha's Doha testimonies that is attributed to Saraha. But in Munidatta's collection of 50 songs, the Chaya Kosha Giti Karavitti Nama, where he collects this 50 so-called Charya Giti, there this line is cited and attributed to Tilopa. And this is, just making the confusion perfect, so to speak. Yeah. Nobody. So you see, even those people that did not really know where things obviously belong to, and the confusion seems to be a rather early one. Okay. Last slide, please. So what we can see is when we think about are these songs uttered spontaneously or what is their real nature, I see that additions have been made, adoptions have been conducted, alterations as well. And the nature of Apabhramsha itself, one may add, suggests, in a certain sense that somebody thought quite properly about their writings before. So why is that the case? Apabhramsha, one should note, is not existing in prose language, and neither seems it ever have to be a spoken dialect other than other Prakrits. So a little bit like Pali, or Esperanto, maybe, if you like. It is a form of language that was used on stage in relation with Sanskrit and other Prakrits, and it was deliberately used, I think, in order to play with certain features. And the fact that you see that half of the lines, like they do all of these kinds of phonetic puns and certain tantric interpretations, and they play, with this interpretation of, let's say, what is so-called common language that you can interpret in a lot of tantric depths, let's say, especially as you see it in Munidatta's collection. This, I think, this does not happen accidentally. I think there is a certain sense of intention must be attributed to this whole phenomenon of Apabhramsha, and I also do not believe that, you know, let's say it like this: I do not know how authentic, you know, somebody using Shakespeare language on a stage, you know, even if you're well trained in this, but I do not know how spontaneous this really then can be. I mean, then we also have to think what actually the nature of spontaneity here refers to. And I think, again, I cannot address all of these matters that are relevant here. I just want to mention this as a small side note when we talk about the nature of compilation and spontaneity. And this is my conclusion here. I shared like these insights that I gained with you. And yeah, the question mark, actually, this is precisely what needs to be resolved. You know, what is really the part here that that can be ascribed to Tilopa? What is really the spontaneous progressive nature that leaves his own footprints, you know, in the song? What is that part? And I'm not sure if anybody will ever be able to figure that out, but you know, maybe this research can help towards that end, and also help us a little bit to understand what is the actual function that these songs serve within the broader frame of Buddhism. Also, again, I cannot address this. I just want to leave it as an open question to think about. Yeah. So that's that. Thank you.
Somebody moderating the questions?
No. Not yet.
But I will start.
I have a question, but I don't like to moderate.
But we both have a mic, so I have a mic first. I will ask first.
Okay.
Is this working? I never use it. Now it's working. I don't hear a difference. Is it now? Yes, now I can hear something. Okay, Julian, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I'd like you to clarify a little bit something about Apabhramsha, because when I was in Bangladesh, a Bangladeshi scholar told me, kind of mocking me, that Apabhramsha is not one particular language or one particular vernacular. It is just the general term for vernacular. Now you are talking about it as not being a vernacular, but more as a, you said not a prose language, but one that has only been used for a certain type of performance, if I understand correctly.
Yes.
And I would like you to explain a little more where you get this information from. Is it a contradiction to what I've heard, and what else you can say about it?
I think it is a specification of what you heard, probably. So you see there is definitions of Apabhramsha, and the most common one goes that basically it is a form of corrupted non-grammatical language. Yeah, so that is the standard definition. I can also show you the places in actual literature where you can find these statements. So this is basically as far as Paninian traditions would be concerned. Yeah, and so now the point is, can we distinguish Prakrits from Apabhramsha? And there seems to be indications on account of which we can do this, in as much as, you know, the borders are not precisely clear, and this is something which people debate about. So in that sense, I would say the statement that you had is not untrue, but you could be a little bit more specific in distinguishing the development of Apabhramsha language, and then see what kind of traces you find in actual spoken language that is actually used or has been used, and whether these features can be also found in Apabhramsha. And there is precisely the point where we are lacking a couple of those indications, whereof scholars whom I trust more than myself came to the conclusion that it should be defined as something that is derived from Prakrits, but it's not the same as the North Indian vernaculars that actually have been spoken and used in other non-poetic forms of literature.
Well, Oh, thank you. I just tried to speak loud.
Okay.
Because of
So then take this one, maybe. Huh?
Oh, now it works. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this great talk. And I fully agree with distinguishing two components in this. One is like the spontaneity of like a realized siddha expressing his realization. On the other hand, you have also this component of compilation. And the idea is maybe like follows, like our common teacher, Khenpo Tsuldim Gyamtso Rinpoche, was expressing himself often in such songs. And he always gave teachings like that. And then you went in for an interview, you translated for somebody a question, and the answer was a song. So, like Karl or Kiki or me, at some point, we have the idea, we should collect all these fantastic songs of our master. And so on this occasion in Scotland, during this course, he gave this fantastic. So we just start to collect and compile. And then, of course, there are different compilations. And then we might just cross-check what we have compilated. And somebody comes, but, Khenpo taught this fantastic 3 songs on this occasion. We add that. And sometimes, something else can slip in. Somebody just passes his own song or a song of another teacher to go into the collection. And so that reminds me a lot of what happened maybe 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So in other words, we have a parallel, multi-dynamic development here, and you showed that very nicely. Yeah, thank you very much.
Welcome, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about female siddhas and their songs of realization. And do we have a slide for this, or like a PDF? So in general, it's very hard to trace specific biographical details of basically any Indian, master, no matter which tradition. Some are a little bit better than others, but it's even worse with the female masters to find anything. And so there's, of course, very few female masters, like much fewer than male ones, at least that we know of. And also there seems to be a tendency to actually obscure their traces. Whether that is deliberate or not, sometimes one has the suspicion it's deliberate, sometimes maybe not. But there's things like, in songs where, in the Tibetan at least, the ending is changed, or the word is changed. Like there's a Indian language version, and the title says something like yogini conduct. And then in the Tibetan, it becomes yoga conduct. And when you look at the song, it's very obvious that it was written by a woman, because she talks about her physical features and all those kinds of things. But if you just look at the title, you would not have any idea. There's also virtually no bios or autobios of women, and with one significant exception, which I'm going to talk about later. So if you want to find any information, and I'm talking mostly about the Mahasiddha tradition here, then you actually have to look at the biographies of the male masters a lot of times, because they are then either between the lines or in other ways in the colophon or somewhere you've then find informations. So when you look at the Tengyur, just statistics, among about 700 authors in the Tengyur, 11 are women, and they're all from probably the 9th to the 11th century, roughly. And so 30 texts are written by these 11 female authors, maybe up to 43. The sum is not clear. Could be, but unsure. Anyway, if you do the math here, then this is like, in terms of the texts, 4,093 texts in the Tengyur, then you have like less than 1% are by women. Then by contrast, if you look at the collection of Mahamudra texts by the 7th Karmapa, Chula Gyamtso, which contains 217 texts, 7 of these are authored by women explicitly. Then there is 5 song collections that have mixed authorship. So it's anthologies of songs, and then there's both male and female authors. Now, when you look at these, then things get very interesting, because then suddenly the number of female authors like soars up like drastically. So when you just look at the titles, you have 217 texts. But if you look at the individual contributions in these anthologies altogether, there's more than 1,000. And out of these, at least almost 300 are by women. So that gives you then about 26% of these texts are by women, which is drastically different than 1% in the Tengyur overall. And some of these are very short. There's sometimes just one stanza, but the same goes for counterparts of male authors, which are then listed as an extra text in the Tengyur. So which means the ratio of female and to male authors is 1 to 3 in this collection, which is radically different than anywhere else. And then when you look at the 84 Mahasiddhas, the well-known 84 Mahasiddhas, only 4 among them are women. But then when you look at the male masters in there, 12 at least had female gurus, and many of them had consorts. Many of them, again, were realized siddhas in their own right. So you can find scattered information about these persons in different sources. And like one of them is, there's a, a book by von Schröder called Empowered Masters. He depicts tankas of the 84 Mahasiddhas, and in those depictions, at least 57 of the male masters are depicted with consorts. But when we say consorts, when you actually read the biographies of the male masters that are available, a lot of times it does not mean consort, it means guru. It's very clear, right? Like it says very clearly, okay, this person instructed Saraha, for example, most famous example. But none of these women show up in any lineage usually. Like the lineage, Mahamudra lineage, then starts with Saraha, not with his teacher. So that's not uncommon. So just to give you a few examples, like in Udayana, there's a lineage which is documented in some texts that are still preserved, which especially like one text is called Sahaja Siddhi Padati by Lakshminkara, who was a woman, a princess, supposedly. And she was from Udayana, and she gives her lineage. And she describes the lineage figures, like she gives a little kind of bio of each one of these. And 5 among these are women. As you can see down here on the Udayana, Lalita Devi, Sahaja Vajra, Vajravati, Brahmani, Lakshminkara, Vilasa Vajra, and then maybe also the ḍākinīs Siddharajini. It might also be from Udayana. So that the Siddharajini is the originator of a very famous Raj Avalokiteshvara empowerment and practice cycle that still exists, is also practiced frequently in Tibetan tradition, but Tibetans usually don't know that it originated with a woman, because again, the female name ending is taken out, so they think it was a man, of course. Another maybe hotbed of female gurus was Kashmir, so Niguma was said to be from there, and also Bhikshuni Lakshmi. So these are just a few snippets to show you they were definitely there, but information is hard to get a lot of times. So one of the major sources is this text by Lakshminkara. She actually provides the lineage, and it's also clear in the Tibetan that these were women, like they have a female ending. And also some of them from the kind of job they're doing, it's also clear they were women. So, and of course, the Siddha environment was not really a domain of women's lib, as we understand it at this point, in an otherwise strongly patriarchal culture. But some women seem to stand out, even at the time. But it seems to be a tendency that the role of women is systematically downplayed, both in India and actually even more in Tibet. So when you look at the contents of the songs of these women, then don't expect, too much female specific whatever things, but they sound very much the same as the songs of the male counterparts, because mostly they talk about Mahamudra, nature of the mind, and all these things. So then let's look at Lakshminkara. So she was said to be, and there's like 3 bios of her, which of course has to be expected, are different. So the most well-known one is in the life stories of the 84 Mahasiddhas, Abhayadatta, and then translated in Daumen and other books, Masters of Mahamudra. So in the classical story, she was a princess, and then King Indrabudhi was her brother and gave her in marriage to a prince from a non-Buddhist country. And then when she saw that people there did animal sacrifice, she refused to marry, locked herself up in the room and pretended to be crazy, unfit as a queen. And so then she managed to escape from the palace, went to the forest, meditated, gained realization. And one time when her husband-to-be was hunting, he came upon her in a cave, and he saw some light coming out of the cave, and then he found, oh, this is my bride. And then he spontaneously gave rise to faith and said, I want to be a student. And then she said, kind of, that's nice of you, but I think there's a little conflict of interest here. So let's not do that. But you can go to the palace, and then there's one of my students, he can teach you. He's one of your latrine sweepers, which, he was the king, right? And so she directed him to this other person who was the latrine sweeper, but he accepted that. So that was one. And then in the same book, Indrabudhi's story also mentions briefly that simply the married princess felt renunciation and fled to the cave. And then Indrabudhi was inspired by her example and then abdicated and became a Mahasiddha too. So, but the really interesting life story is Lakshminkara's autobiography, which is the only one I know of any Indian Buddhist Mahasiddha. And so she's very matter of fact, no frills. Basically, she said, I always wanted to search out the meditation of Mahamudra or the Cornate. And I looked for a teacher. And then I heard that this yogi Chittavajra was an expert in this meditation. So I trained with him and he gave me the instructions. I focused my mind on it, on Sri Parvata, and then I realized it. And then, interestingly, she said, I taught Indrabudhi in various ways, leading him to realization. So she was obviously King Indrabudhi's guru. And so she said, Indrabudhi was distracted by the kingdom. I instructed him to renounce it and become a monk, but the ministers and other people still followed him. And then she was in retreat again, and she said, your brother's in trouble, like they won't let him be a meditator. They want him to be king. And so she went back there and then said to him, why have you still not abandoned your kingdom? I said, I tried, but they just don't leave me alone, these people, and tell me what to do. And she said, go to charnel grounds and focus your mind on true reality. And then he gained realization like that. And she probably said more. And the interesting part is that in this story, then it says that Lakshminkara came to Indrabudhi at night when nobody could see it. And since nobody else was there, he prostrated to her 3 times, which would have been impossible at daylight with people around because he was the king. He was just his sister. So there's no reason to doubt that her account that this has happened. But then when you look at so her own story doesn't mention any kind of marriage or anything like that, but it emphasizes her becoming an advanced meditator and guru of her older brother, Indrabudhi. But then when you look at the lineage stories and the narratives of later times of Indrabudhi, invariably she's always his student. So her account is the only one that actually says that she was his guru. And also interestingly, Indrabudhi's Sahaja Siddhi, which is the text that Lakshminkara comments on, like Indrabudhi's own text, omits her as in the list of his teachers. So just to add that, so this Princess Lakshminkara is not to be confused with the famous Bhikshuni Lakshmi, also known as Sister Palmo, the originator of the Nyungne practice, though even Tibetan accounts conflate the two frequently. So in the Tengyur, you have 3 texts of Lakshminkara. 2 belong to the cycle of Siddhi texts, Advaya Siddhi and Sahaja Siddhi Padati that I mentioned. And then she has a sadhana of Jinamunda, the severed-headed Vajrayogini. And then 3 songs. So just to give you a little flavor of what she did. So you can, as you know, she was called the Crazy Princess. So when you look at this song, it sounds a little crazy. Severing your head and fresh butter, you're breaking the blade of the axe. A frog will swallow an elephant. Aho, the woodcutter is laughing. Aho, amazing Mago, hey, don't entertain doubts in your mind. If you're stunned, Avadutipa, don't create thoughts in your mind. Aho, a famished monkey gobbles down morsels of rock. Aho, the experience of the mind cannot be expressed by anybody. Aho, amazing Mago, hey, don't entertain doubts in your mind. If you're stunned, Avadutipa, what's the point of a mind with doubts? So this is basically like a pointing out instruction by basically, and this goes on for a long time like this. This is just an excerpt. So she gives all these, weird examples to basically like empty the mind of the student, right? Like what's going on here? And then at the end, she says, the experience of the mind cannot be expressed by anybody. So it's basically getting the student to a state of gap, of stopping thoughts or trying to grasp something rational here. And then at that point, then saying, this is what you need to look at. Okay, so this was a little something snippet on Lakshminkara. Then there's 2 other Mahasiddhas in the 84 Mahasiddhas, female, Mekhala and Kanakala, which kind of means the younger and the older naughty sister. So they were both housewives in a little village, and the neighbors treated them badly. And then one day, Kanapa came by, and so the Mahasiddha Kanapa, and then he taught them. They asked him to be their teacher. So he gave them a practice which they performed secretly at night, while during the day, pretending to be just regular housewives. And they gained realization. And then they went back to Kanapa or Krishna, as is his more Sanskritized name. And they said, they paid homage to him and said, remember us. We are the young women from that village. You are our teacher. And first he pretended not to remember them. And then he said, if you are my students, you should offer me something. And so then they sang the song. And while doing so, they chopped off their heads as offering. So, and this is said also one story of how this practice of the, or how they showed their realization of the practice of the severed head Vajrayogini, because this is what we were practicing. So they said, it's through the blessings of the Guru's instructions, fusing creation and completion, we destroy the distinction between samsara and nirvana. View and conduct united in concordant harmony, we destroy the distinction of accepting and rejecting. Right within the union of space and awareness, we destroy the distinction between self and others. As tokens of the ineffable, we offer these our gifts. And that's when they cut off their heads. And there's pictures where you see that the 2 dancing, and then the blood spurts out of the carotids, and they hold the cup, and the blood then goes into the skull cup, the head, and the blood spurts into the skull as the offering vessel. So then the third one is that I'm briefly going to talk about is the ḍākinī Niguma. And yeah, a lot of her is actually not known, or it's more or less, legendary. There's no hard evidence really, in the sense of, the modern sense. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about her encounter with Kyungpo Naljor, who was the founder of the Shangpa-Kaji lineage. And so Niguma and Sukhasiddhi, they were two of his main teachers. And it's said that from among his 28 main Indian teachers, 7 were women, which also is, as far as lineage goes, significant, like just 25%. So Kyungpo Naljor was looking for Niguma, and then the people said, if someone has pure perception, then you can see her anywhere. But those with impure perception, they need to search. But she has recently transformed into a rainbow body. But they said she occasionally shows up in this charnel ground, so Sattvipa, to preside over the Gana chakras. So when Kyungpo Naljor got her, he saw Niguma with dark colored skin hovering in the sky. And she was ornamented with bone ornaments, holding a trident and skull cup, dancing and displaying various forms. And then Kyungpo Naljor requests teachings. But she said, I'm a flesh-eating ḍākini. When my retinue arrives, you'll be devoured. So you better get out now while you still can. So this is a very common trope in a lot of Mahasiddha stories, that there's some encounter with a more or less threatening female yogini ḍākini figure. And these days, I think a lot of people, they think of ḍākini as this kind of, some people even call them angels, which is like the furthest from what they are. But anyway, like ḍākini actually in India today, if you ask, or if you use the word ḍākini, it still has the connotation of witch, like in the traditional sense. So it's not, a compliment exactly. And then the way in which ḍākinis appear in the stories of the Mahasiddhas is also often in terrifying form. So it's always a kind of a test. And so Kyungpo Naljor then says, now I still want to get the teachings. And then she said, if you want teachings, then you need gold. And if you give me gold, I'll teach you, Niguma said. So Kyungpo offered, it says 500 ounces of gold, but she just threw it into the forest, which also is a common theme. And then the ḍākinis entourage of other ḍākinis then came, and then they constructed for the empowerment, for the teaching, they constructed a mandala in the space. And then she bestowed the empowerments for illusory body and all kinds of things, and dream. And then she transports him, Kyungpo Naljor, to a mountain 25 miles away. And in the sky above that golden mountain, then the ḍākinis perform a feast and dance. And Kyungpo Naljor then asks if it is really somewhere in India, this mountain, or if it is just a magical projection. And she replies with probably the most famous verse in one of her famous poems, which is called The Path of Illusion. She says, this variety, and this is on the screen, this variety of desirous and hateful thoughts that strands us in the ocean of samsara, once realized to lack an intrinsic nature, makes everything a land of gold, my child. So this was her comment on being offered the gold and being tossed into the forest. If you meditate on illusion-like nature, of phenomena that are illusion-like, actual illusion-like Buddhahood dawns through devotion's power. So this is her instruction on that everything is illusion-like, not just samsaric phenomena, but also the path and the realization. But how does it come about? How does the fruition come about in this illusory manner is through equally illusory devotion. And then Niguma commands Kyungpo Naljor to recognize his dreams by her blessing, which he does. And so he has the dream experience of traveling to the land of the gods and is swallowed by a gigantic asura. And then he receives the instructions on the 6 dharmas from Niguma. And she says that no one ever has received the complete teaching in one nap in all of India. So the interesting thing is that in this whole story, it's not clarified when the dream starts. Like it could be from the very beginning, when Kyungpan Aldra encounters Niguma, or from the time when he arrives at this mountain. So that, but anyway, Josie obviously gives him pointing out instructions within this dreamlike experience. And then it says he wakes up finally. And then he gives him the 6 dharmas again, 3 times in the waking state. So he received it first in the dream and then in the waking state. So this blurring of seeming realities, it's also a common theme in the Mahasiddha stories where you really don't know, is this real or not? Or is this happening in a dream or whatever? There's also another text where Maitripa receives pointing out instruction in a dream from Maitreya, like to recognize his dream mind as he's dreaming. So this was just a little snippet here and there, not very organized. But that's the nature of the Mahasiddha tradition, which is, just up my alley. Anyway, I collected more sources on this and whatever, stories and all kinds of things, and you have to look in a lot of different places. There's really just snippets here and there, but it's very interesting to, unearth a little bit more of the role of female practitioners. And actually to this day in India, there are spiritual traditions where female gurus are very normal. They're not an exception, and they're also accepted as that. So given that, I think it was the same at those times. It was not different, but a lot of this then became obscured later in the tradition and both India and Tibet. So to unearth these, I think it's definitely worthwhile. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. It was great. I'm actually kind of researching this also, this theme. And so I wanted to know, what are your methods or what are you processes to go by to find these?
Well,
snippets
at this point, yes.
Oh,
So at this point, it hasn't been very organized because I didn't start this as a project, try to find facts about female Mahasiddhas. But since I'm translating a lot of Doha's collection, Mahamudra text and stuff, and sometimes things pop up here and there. Then I got more interested. And then I tried to find more in, mostly male, looking through the usual suspects, blue annals or, Taranata's 7 instruction lineages and all kinds of things. And there is some information. And I'm also going to translate this text by Lakshminkara, like her autobiography and the whole lineage and that. So, but, this is not finished at all. This is just a sketch at this point, like collecting materials. So if you have a, better systematic approach, then please let me know. But it's very hard to have a systematic approach because it's scattered all over the place. And there's also all these things, where they do the changing the name endings. And sometimes you can actually find a female name ending in another text. Sometimes not, but sometimes you can suspect from the content of the text. So there's all these things. And then there's also cases when you look at the colophon, like for example, there's one song by Shavaripa in the Tengyur, which is listed under his name. But when you look in the colophon, it says very clearly, these songs were uttered by Shavaripa and his 2 consorts. They're mentioned by name. So it's actually by 3 persons. But if you don't know that, in the Tengyur, in the catalog, it only says Shavaripa. So there's lots of these things. So it's basically mostly stumbling upon stuff.
great. And then my other question was, besides the text, have you looked at anything they're saying, I think I've read finding women donors, inscriptions, like you did actually mention pictures of the women in them, things of this sort.
Yeah, there's Tanka collections, and some of them are available now in Western languages with descriptions of the 84 Mahasiddhas or other collections of Mahasiddhas. There's not just 84, but there's many different lists of Mahasiddhas, ranging from 8 up to 365. There's that, and then I haven't really looked a lot into inscriptions, but that's definitely another alley to pursue.
Just a note, you might be interested. One student here is working on Lakshmin's Kara material, and she's working with a Nepali master who is teaching a dance, a sadhana. It's secret, obviously, but there is material that is still being passed on orally right now on that is relating with Lakshman Kara. So maybe I could put you in contact.
Yeah, thank you. I think there is actually a lot of material in the Nevari Buddhist tradition, but it's very hard to get any access. Klaus?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you for this overview, because only after having read so much material, you can like point out like that the role of female authors and gurus has been so much downplayed, to the extent that transmission lineage have been changed, and this is really shocking, I have to say. Yeah, but and thanks for pointing this out and sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just a messenger. But I mean, obviously, personally, I would think it's much better if women did that research. I just stumbled upon it, and as I say, it's not systematic or anything, and I don't know whatever comes out of it, but I find it interesting.
Well, I disagree. I think gender should not matter at all anymore.
I think men obscure it, and they can also, yeah. Why not?
Yeah. Anyway, whoever wants to do it.
I sometimes thought I must have messed up, like translation in the past seriously, when I see what I have to do now. Yeah. And, like to try to figure it out and put it back together. Like in my past, I must have been an incredibly unsuccessful pundit, at one point.
Okay.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Since you yourself mentioned that despite the fact that these were female authors, there wasn't anything kind of intradiegetic that marked this femininity. Like you said, that basically the texts were the same kind of instructions or the same kind of things that might be found by male teachers. What do you think is the importance then that these were actually, that they have female authorship? Is it mostly from our contemporary historical vantage point to like look at the way the female lineage was suppressed or endings were changed? Or do you think that looking at things relationally, we can discover some distinctive feature in terms of instructions or the way the Dharma is taught if the teacher is female? Or in the end, from within to the tradition and practice, does it not make a difference? Or I really don't know, I'm asking you.
Well, I think one thing is that, it's just good to know, okay, there were women who actually practiced these things, and also women who were gurus, right? Because, also even in this day and age, and if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, that is not a given at all. Like, how many Tibetan female Rinpoche gurus do you know? So obviously this was actually more the case in India. And I think that's interesting in itself to see that. And then whether there's, specific female teaching styles or elements, I can't say at this point, because there's not enough material, or at least I haven't looked at it in a very systematic manner that I could, I mean, that's a PhD on its own, if not more. I can't say, but it could be, yeah. Like, I haven't found anything that really stood out, except for those songs where the women actually talk clearly from a female perspective, like they talk about their own body, for example. And like that one song by Dombi Yogini, which is in the Tengyur attributed to Dombi Heruka. It runs under his name. The colophon also says it's by Dombi Heruka. And then when you read the text, it starts with, you know, I'm not a prostitute with a beautiful body and all those kinds of things. I don't think Dombi Heruka would have said that. So it's kind of obvious. And then she uses that. It's a very interesting song because she uses her relationship. She talks about her relationship to Dombi Heruka and how that destroys her ego and things like that. So, but that's one example. That's not, you know, there's not many of those. So yeah, that's, you know, further research. But I do think it matters. I think, should we move on?
We can also keep a couple of maybe we can keep a couple of those questions for later, and perhaps Julia can continue. I mean, it's obviously always highly interesting to talk about women in Buddhism. So when we now do not stop, then we will never stop. So so we have to postpone a few minutes.
Okay, hi everyone, and my presentation is on Saraha's 4 symbols and the question of spontaneity. So in that sense, a little bit it connects to Julian's talk. I start with a quote. The essence of spiritual songs is their spontaneity, their immediacy, the momentary capturing of a transformed state of mind, states Geshe Thupten Jinpa in the introduction to his book, Songs of Spiritual Experience. I will tell you, it's actually not yet the next slide. With this understanding in mind, I was astonished when translating Tantric poetry by Saraha, the Indian Mahasiddhas celebrated as the founding father of Mahamudra, to discover the frequent use of what seems to be rather standardized philosophical terminology. The employment of this high degree of formalism seems to contradict this idea of spontaneity, of reading the poetic expression of an individual's spontaneous, immediate, and personal experience. I was not sure whether this formalism was a problem of translation or actually a characteristic of Tantric poetry. Over the years, I have been involved in translating several of Saraha's poems. After knowing Saraha at first only as a figure of the Mahamudra lineage and as part of the Gampopa Guru Yoga, I then discovered his poetry through Laura Britstein, my academic supervisor for my MA and my PhD. During the pandemic, she included me in a translation group that worked on Saraha's alphabet Doha and commentary, the Kake Doha and Kake Doha Shepa, which we also looked at together with Karl. And then it was followed by a retranslation of Saraha's trilogy of Adamantine songs. And here I just listed the names for you, for those who are interested in the details. Laura Britstein translated this trilogy for her dissertation in 2004, edited for the publication of her book, Saraha's Adamantine Songs, in 2014. And we are currently translating it yet again for the 84,000 in a style that reflects more the PIS instructions of Saraha. Nevertheless, the frequent use of standard terminology remains, at least when translating from Tibetan. And there I'd like to hear from the Apabhramsha specialists if you come up with other conclusions. So in this paper, I will reflect on the tension between spontaneity and formalism in Saraha's poetry. I will explore an example of the codified language and technical terminology that we find in Saraha's body treasury called the Immortal Adamantine Song, namely the example of the 4 symbols, dashi in Tibetan, a recurrent topic in many of Saraha's songs. These 4 are in Tibetan, Demba, Demme, Kyewa, Kyewameba, or Kyeme, and Lode. And I have a slide later on explaining them. They have been translated by Herbert Günther. I think he was the first one to translate them as memory, non-memory, non-origination, and release from the intellect. I will briefly discuss the meaning and various connotations of these 4 symbols and the type of formalism they express. And then I will explore the semantic field of spontaneity, drawing on the work of Matilda Perks, who did research on Chogyam Trungpa's poetry and on romantic poetry a little bit. And in conclusion, I will argue that the spontaneity of intuitive insight, as it is taught in the Buddhist tradition, is only superficially a contradiction, but in fact a result of formalism. Okay, now coming to these 4 symbols in Saraha's writing. The 4 terms, Jinba, Jinme, Kyeme, and Lode, occur frequently in Saraha's poetry. They describe mental stages of a meditator. The 4 terms occur also in Karma Trinipa's story about Saraha, his life, in a crucial passage where Saraha meets his female guru. He found in the marketplace a woman of low caste who was making her 4-piece arrow with intense concentration, it is said. He asked her if she was an arrowsmith, and she replied, "My dear young man, the Buddha's meaning can be shown through symbols and actions, not through words and books." And then she goes on to explain the symbolic meaning of the arrow to Saraha, and he recognizes her as a teacher. Then he abandons his studies and his monastic vows, the story tells us, and he moves to a cremation ground with her to practice. While watching her, coming back to the scene on the market, while watching her concentrated fabrication of an arrow, Saraha gains an intuitive understanding of the symbolic meaning of, well, these 4 symbols and of her work in general. He sees the 4-fold split at the base of the arrow as the 4-fold symbolism of Mahamudra. And now on the next slide, Georgila, I have put together these different translations. So in the first column, you have the Tibetan, Demba, Jemme, Kyeme, Lode. I have some Sanskrit, but I'm not sure. I think that was reconstructed. So then in the first row there, you have Günther from the book Ecstatic Spontaneity, 1993. He has the translations memory, or mentation, he also said at one point, non-memory, unorigination and transcendence. Then Lara Britstein, for the same words in her book, has recognition and decognition for Drenpa and Jinme, and then unborn and beyond the intellect. And Klaus, in your article of the 4 signs of Mahamudra, you use mindfulness, beyond mindfulness, non-arising, and transcending the intellect. And now in this retranslation of Lara and myself, we are using thinking, non-thinking for Drenpa and Jinme, unborn, and then for Lode, we have used beyond rationality, but I have some doubts about that one. Sometimes it fits well, but anyway, we can talk about that later. So the 4 terms, they have been explained in various ways. Denba is usually the term for mindfulness. Literally, it means actually recollection or memory. However, in this context here, Saraha explains this term to mean ordinary thinking that involves a dualistic frame of mind. The second term is the absence of this dualistic functioning of the mind. And to express the codependence of these terms, Lara Britstein translated them as recognition and decognition. This pair of terms also nicely expresses the formalism that these terms represent. However, in our most recent translation, we opted for the words thinking and non-thinking, even though there are actually other terms, as you all know, Tibetan terms for thinking. Nevertheless, we chose these terms because if we read Saraha's Vajragiti as meditation instructions, thinking and non-thinking come closest to the actual meaning. And on the next slide, I chose few of his verses from the Vajragiti that explain thinking and non-thinking, and actually the 4 symbols. So on the left side, you have the Tibetan. If you're interested, I will only read the English on the right side. So there's one verse. Sadhana doesn't really number them, but if you want to number them, there as 4 lines of a sloka, it would be 37. And he says, how do you define the Great Seal? It is non-duality of thinking and non-thinking, hence unborn. Being beyond rationality and like space, there is nowhere it does not abide. And later on, Sarah says, thinking is by nature luminosity that has been grasped. Get rid of the twofold clinging and rest in the genuine nature, he instructs. Therefore, the Great Seal is the highest union. It unites thinking, non-thinking, and the unborn. Non-thinking is the nature of non-thought. Yeah, so here he says it quite clearly, and in the Tibetan it says, "Denme mitokpa rangshin." So there, mitokpa and demba is put side by side. So non-thinking is the nature of non-thought, and thinking is born of dependent arising and is adventitious. These two are of one taste in the unborn state. Therefore, arising and the arisen are beyond rationality. These 4 terms not only represented the formal codification of language in the poetry of Sadaha, they represent the codification actually of the gradual meditation practice. If we follow Karma Trinipa's commentary, we learn that they have been associated with various stages of the path. There's the 4 stages of Mahamudras, the 4 joys, the 4 seals, the 4 meditative absorptions of the sutra tradition. So here the formalism is not only in the language, but actually refers to the gradual path itself. All these classifications express a gradual approach to meditation rather than a spontaneous breakthrough to awakening that Sadaha's poetry seems to express in other verses, in which he actually mocks the followers of such a formal path. The Vajragiti, the same one, begins actually where he talks about various groups of Buddhists and says, particularists, followers of Sutra and Tantra, yogis, followers of the middle way, etc., criticize each other and argue. They don't understand suchness. They don't understand that it is manifest yet empty like space. Yeah. So here, all these particularists, followers of Sutra and Tantra and so on, they are all people who practice formalism and proceed on a gradual path. But for Sadaha, that is just a major hang-up. So now I will not go into the details of these symbols anymore, because they have actually been discussed at length by Klaus in his discussion of Karma Trinipa's commentary. Instead, I want to move on to spontaneity. Yeah, my point here was only to show this tension between formalism and spontaneity in Sadaha's poetry. Now, talking about spontaneity, and Dorjila, you can just move on. The next slide is just for entertainment, Sadaha's. So, spontaneity. I start with a quote again. First thought is best, then you compose. Quote end. This line opened a 1972 poem jointly composed by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche and the American Beat Generation poet Allen Ginsberg. Ginsberg later reformulated this line into first thought, best thought, a succinct slogan that expresses Trungpa and Ginsberg's shared approach to poetic composition, in which spontaneity was the most important component. Ginsberg recalls Trungpa Rinpoche telling him to perform spontaneously on stage as a form of poetry improvisation on the spot, encouraging him to trust his own mind. I skipped ahead. Scholars like Buddhist scholars, yeah, like David McMahon, you might have read his Buddhist modernism. He understood Trungpa's instruction on spontaneity actually as primarily being influenced by romantic ideals. Yeah, the ideals that McMahon describes as a call for return to the natural and a privilege of the artist's spontaneous utterance from the formal training involved in crafting literary verse. So according to McMahon, Trungpa actually goes back to the Romantics. And although Matilda Perks in her thesis argues convincingly against the influence of the Romantics on Chogyam Trungpa, she shows that there's actually a traditional Tibetan source for it. For us now here, I think it is useful to elucidate the notions of spontaneity that circulated in the Romantic era in the late 18th and 19th century in Europe, embodied by poets such as the English William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We find interesting parallels and divergences from Tantric poetry ideas on spontaneity. So according to the Romantic ideal, the poetic genius creates poetry naturally, without long labor or study. Romantic writers suggest that the poet work is done within a moment. Scholar Angela Esterhammer explains the criterion of Romantic poetry as extemporaneous, meaning outside of time, or improvised, means unforeseen, out of the normal. So not according to the normal past, present, and future progression. Such poems claim to be in and of the moment. They claim to be a mode of composition radically different from the process of meditation and reflection that usually is associated with the creation of literary work, where the pace of writing can vary and the writer can turn back with second and third thoughts. Especially when improvisation is performed orally before an audience, it becomes clear that this compression of time seeks to elide the difference between the thought that is coming up and its verbal expression. Yeah, it all happens at the same time, just like Trungpa asked Allen Ginsberg to perform. Romantic poets such as Coleridge describe their creative process as swift and trance-like. His poem called Kublai Khan, he says, rose up before him as things with a parallel production of the correspondent expression, without any sensation of consciousness or effort. Another Romantic poet, Percy Shelley, compares the creation to the coal and embers of a fire. Her book, Defense of Poetry, valorizes an instantaneous inspiration according to which the mind in creation is as a fading coal, a fading ember, with which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. So here the image of the fading coal or ember encapsulates this belief that a poem is better and more authentic the more quickly it arises from the transitory moment of inspiration. So this idea of putting spontaneous composition on display for an audience was developed in the Romantic area by poetic improvisation that we find in the Mediterranean countries, especially in Italy, a tradition that gained a lot of popularity across Europe during the Romantic period. By the 19th century, these performances took on a theatricalized form that bears certain resemblance in modern improv or poetry slams. And actually also the Tibetan culture seems to have had this kind of poetry improvisation and competition as a form of entertainment. In reflecting on improvisation, coming back again to this Romantic scholar Esterhammer, she asks the crucial question about the challenge that performance brings to the ideal of naturalness. She asked, can poetic genius be theatricalized can it be exposed to the viewer or even a reader's gaze without succumbing to artificiality and convention? Yeah, meaning that as soon as you have the gaze of others, is it really still natural, even if you improvise on stage? And that, of course, might remind us of this idea of tantric poetry, which too was performed in front of an audience. Yeah? Sadaha's king and queen and people's Doha tell us the circumstances under which Sadaha supposedly performed in front of a public audience. And we often read also that tantric songs of experience were performed at Ganachakras, yeah? These tantric feasts where other yogis and yoginis listened to the performance. Actually, Julian has pointed out that we should get rid of the often repeated misunderstanding that the term Charyagiti, which means performance song, Chupelu in Tibetan, refers to the simple idea of performing a song, but instead acknowledge that the term connotes the content of the song, meaning actually a song on tantric conduct. And we can come back to that in the discussion later. I found that very interesting. Julian also expresses doubts about the idea of improvisation of tantric poetry based on his analysis of the nature of Apabhramsha, which he explains was not spoken but used in poetry, as we just heard. Yeah. Characterized by a skillful and deliberate use of the linguistic features of Apabhramsha, which likely necessitated preparation and training that preceded the composition. And that was a quote from his paper. So now this idea of preparation and training that precedes composition leads me to, well, first of all, back to the question, what is actually the nature of spontaneity? But then also to the question, is it really diametrically opposed to training and preparation? One aspect of spontaneity, as we just heard, is this temporal immediacy. But what about the content of that spontaneous experience? It is said to be natural and genuine, which meant something actually quite different for the Romantics than it meant for the Mahasiddhas. The Romantic poet William Wordsworth explains, quote, "All good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. In contrast, for Sadaha, it seems to be the spontaneous overflow of suchness, of the great seal, or a state beyond duality, in which there is, quote, no effort in anything, no views, nothing to accept or reject, no differentiating center or perimeter." That also comes from the Vajragiti, so quite different to expressing powerful feelings. Despite these blatant differences about the state of naturalness that these two different traditions seek to express in spontaneity, there is some convergence in the idea that not just any unfiltered expression is valuable. Yeah, also this poet Wordsworth describes a crucial qualification of the poet. And here again, a quote by him, he says, "Poems to which any value can be attached were never produced on a variety of subjects, but by a man who, being possessed of more than usual organic sensibility, had also thought long and deeply." Yeah, so the poet, of course, a man, had thought long and deeply. And only on that basis, then spontaneity can come out. Yeah. He insists that the spontaneous overflow of feelings takes place in tranquility and solitude. Its products may be for public consumption, but the act of creation itself is internal and private. And he says the genius poet is described actually now by another Romantic poet as a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds. Okay, so much for the Romantics. Now coming really to Buddhism, the idea that only a genius is capable of expressing spontaneously words of wisdom is not unfamiliar in Buddhism, I would say. To give just one example from Karl's translations of the book Straight from the Heart, There he mentions Rinpoche, who is said to have spontaneously uttered his songs on the view, that's the title, when he attained the first bhumi of a bodhisattva. And that first bhumi is called Supreme Joy, and therefore the verses expressed, they express also this exuberant joy that radiates through the verses. Rinpoche gets to the heart of the matter, making the union of dependent origination and emptiness a living experience in one's own mind, meaning the mind of the one who listens or hears these songs. So in the Buddhist traditions, as we know, a genius is not just destiny, but actually a genius can be trained, even though that can take many lifetimes. Therefore, the debate about spontaneity versus formalism is actually a facet of this old debate about the subitis, the chikcharva in Tibetan, and the gradual approach, the rimkipa, to realization. For Victor Hori, one of my professors at McGill University, professor of Japanese Buddhism and also a Zen master who trained many years in Japan, spontaneous, genuine insight is the product of ritual formalism that has been interiorized. He gives a lengthy explanation of the relationship between formalism and spontaneous insight that is worth quoting in full. So here I quote from him. I was first struck by the connection between the formalism of rote learning and the spontaneity of insight long before I entered the Zen monastery. As a graduate student in philosophy, I taught propositional logic to first and second year university students and noticed that the class divided into two groups, those who could solve the logic problems and those who could not. Those who could solve them started by memorizing the basic transformation formula of propositional logic. Having committed these formula to memory, these students were thereby able to solve the logic problems because they could just see common factors in the equations and then cancel them out, or they could just see logical equivalences. However, the other students, those who had not committed the transformation formula to memory, were more or less mystified by the problems, though many made serious attempts to reason their way through. Some of these latter students said that the ability to solve such problems was like musical ability, that successful problem solvers had a special ability to just see the answers to the logic problems, just as people with musical ability can just hear when a note is flat or sharp. And they excused themselves by saying that they had not been born with that particular gene. But in fact, Victor Hori continues, those who had done the rote memory work had developed logical insight, while those who had not developed logical insight were the ones who had skipped the rote memory work, thinking they could reason their way through the logical problems. Quote end. And Victor Hori then, in his article, goes on to describe the various elements of his own Rinzai monastery monastic education as ways of formalized training that result in intuitive insight. A similar view of traditional Buddhist learning is expressed by Thupten Jinpa in the book that I mentioned already, The Songs of Spiritual Experience, this time more directly related to poetry. Jinpa writes that at first glance, all the rules of meter, metaphor, language encouraged by formalism have the effect of hindering the natural flow of spontaneity in favor of technically refined forms. And he elaborates, again, somebody telling about his experience, he says, in the beginning of my study of the Kavya Darsha, the Sanskrit rules pertaining to poetry, one problem that troubled me was the thought that this was all so difficult. Because before my formal studies, I had written verses quite easily and spontaneously, poems that I thought at the time were rather beautiful. Now it took forever to write even a single verse, which felt labored rather than free. I raised this issue with Zime Rinpoche, implying that all this mechanical learning was more of a hindrance than a help, that it was obstructing my natural flow. Rinpoche replied that true perfection comes from the harnessing of a natural gift to a skillful command. The rigors of the Kavyadarsha, he said, offer an incomparably deeper resourcefulness to the poet. Pure spontaneity without discipline remains at the level of a child. The child may offer a direct insight, but it is haphazard, the result of chance. If the skilled poet can combine expertise with the freshness of a child, he becomes a master. After my study of the Kavyadarsha, when I looked back on my old verses, I became to appreciate this point. This ends the quote by Thupten Jinpa. Now, to conclude, it has become clear that spontaneity should be understood as the result of formalized training rather than its opposite. Spontaneity is meaningless when it is the random act of an uncultivated mind. And I think this is quite a familiar thought in Buddhist training. Yeah? As Trungpa puts it, by the way, I have another picture, Dorji, Trungpa Rinpoche and Allen Ginsberg in spontaneous performance. So Trungpa says, we are not talking about, and I quote here, nouveau art in terms of just do what you like, spill a pot of ink on paper and hope for the best. I love that, yeah, hope for the best. We are talking about a highly trained mind to begin with, highly trained intention and attention and a state of your mind that is highly trained. And that is what transmits through your body and through your perceptions, end quote. The highly trained mind that Trungpa Rinpoche here has been mentioned here has been formed by formal ritual in many ways. So what is the function of ritual? Actions are ritualized to endow them with a special and sacred meaning. Ritualized acts function as symbols. Ritual is done for cathartic effect. There's also an educational use for ritual formalism. It trains consciousness. Each particular ritual acts in Buddhism has not only a prescribed behavioral form, but there's also a prescribed attitude, a prescribed state of mind. For example, the making of prostrations or the offering of food, for example, they are all done with a particular attitude of repentance or of devotion. The ritual fails if it is not done with sincerity. Yeah. Therefore, meditation is one of the, not therefore, just centrally, meditation is one of the central ritual practices of Buddhism. It is directed towards either the cultivation of attitudes such as loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, or it aims at the eradication of all these attachments, all conceptual thinking, all confusions. One repeats and repeats the prescribed act with the prescribed state of mind until one no longer has to will them consciously. Yeah? They have become second nature. And therefore then there's spontaneity, there's some kind of natural feeling with the wisdom, devotion, and loving kindness that has been trained. In this sense, then, one can perhaps understand the repetitions of formalized terminology in Tantric songs of experience as the result of a lifelong training that leads the yogi poets to having embodied the teachings to a degree that they have become second nature. The symbolic terminology allows the expression of complex realities in just a few words, the meaning of which is shared with this adept yogic community. When Sadhaka uses the four symbols to express his ineffable spiritual experience, he relies on his acquired framework, which is also shared framework with this yogic community. At the same time, his conventional or his unconventional use actually of Drenpa and Drenme that I mentioned before also shows how he playfully breaks out of that framework. And that is the end of my reflections on spontaneity.
Thank you very much for this fantastic talk. And the question, do I understand you right that, like, even though Apabhramsha may be an artificial language, but if you train in it and learn it properly, and then you are also at some point able to express yourself spontaneously in an artificial language. And the decisive element would be realization, or like wisdom, and realizing your true nature of mind, which is the source of this ability to be spontaneous.
Yes, to a certain degree. I'm not an Apabhramsha expert, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you what you have to say about Apabhramsha. Therefore, I was saying in the beginning, my reflections actually refer to the Tibetan translations, and there I wasn't sure how much this formalized language is the result of this codified way of translation into Tibetan, how much it was, how many Apabhramsha terms were actually merged into one single Tibetan term, which then would explain why you have this repetition of certain expressions. But apart from that, generally speaking, yes, it seems to me that there is the mind training at the basis. There is formal education in terms of for example, these symbolic terms, which have a life, a world on its own. And once you're familiar with these both, you can play with it.
Yeah, just to be sure, I mean, let's get away from Apabhramsha. Let's take Chöke. That's also an artificial language to some extent. But let's say you are learning Chöke from young age when you're a monk, and then you grow up with this language. And then, you know, like at some point, you could express yourself in Chöke spontaneously, isn't it? Even though it is an artificial language.
Yes, yeah. It was more what astonished me, the lack of what I thought were individualized private expressions of my mental states, as we might know them from the romantic English poetry. And therefore I was investigating where this might have come from.
Then just allow me a short defense of my translation of Tremba as mindfulness, which is based on Karma Trinlepa's commentary. And there is this famous Doha on Ganat Chakra. It says, Sashing Tungshing Nyamchor Dang, Kolo Yangdang Yangdu King. So these 4 elements of Ganat Chakra, like eating, drinking, intercourse, and filling the chakra, is related to the 4 like Da.
Yeah.
And so Karma Trinlepa explains, well, you eat the appearances by becoming like aware of them, by concentrating on the appearances. You realize that they are a projection of mind, so you eat them.
Yeah.
And then there is no perceiving subject, so you drink the mind, and then you have appearance and emptiness inseparable. That's the union. And so in this context, mindfulness makes sense. But well, I have to look at your material, whether thinking works there. Probably yes.
Well, I wasn't criticizing any of the other translations. I think they worked perfectly in their own context. And I love this work of Karma Trinlepa and how he uses what in Sadhaha's poetry still seems a little bit chaotic, and he puts it into all these fourfold systems, which there I would say that's maybe not exactly the spirit of Sadhaha, because he never comes up with that degree of systematization. But the way he does it, and thereby brings in these different tantric traditions with the Sadhaha's yoga tradition, I think that is genius. Yeah, and therefore mindfulness as the first stage in meditation makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Will you allow me one comment shortly? You
Very.
first. Okay, you first. Please go ahead.
Really, Julian? It's okay?
Yeah, it's more, I feel, for you who have been sitting here for a long time.
So thank you, Julia, for your talk. So I'm wondering, so I have to put together 2 things. At one point in the middle, you said there's kind of this pivotal or decisive question of, in the performance context, if the gaze or the auditory kind of attention of the receiver doesn't necessarily introduce some level of artifice into the spontaneity of the performer.
Yeah.
Okay, so keep that in mind. But then you've beautifully demonstrated how what seems to be like an opposition between what you called formalism and spontaneity ends up being a productive tension, wherein the formalism itself is preparatory for the release of this spontaneity. So then I'm wondering if we could loop back to that decisive question and say if the controlled or the performance structure doesn't allow for some kind of transaction to take place, so that rather than the gaze or the auditory attention being reifying, that in fact there's something about the aesthetic transmission that makes it so that the recipient actually suspends their disbelief, or that it works the other way around. So I'm just trying to make an analogy between what you talked about, the tension, which turns out not to be a tension between formalism and spontaneity, and how you might loop that back to the question of artifice. Like if it doesn't go the other way, like why the gaze has to introduce artifice rather than the performance structure allows for something else to happen on the part of the recipient.
Interesting thought, but it sounds like something we should keep for the later discussion. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Just super short. First of all, thank you very much. That was really beautiful. And this is precisely what I think is important, that we actually negotiate our way through how we define the terms that we use, because I think that spontaneity is a label that we not necessarily understand in the same way like it is probably meant in the tradition. This reminds me, for instance, of this very famous unmata vrata, the bad conduct, where people think, I'm free to do what I want, which is not at all the case. You're free to do what you want when you reached a certain stage. And this is, of course, made explicit more than once in the text themselves, right? And there also, with spontaneity, I think it is the same. When we look at it like you define it, it makes perfectly sense. And what I was trying to show, of course, is that the idea with which we approach it, how we think of spontaneity, I just utter something. That's never how it has happened. And we should also not forget that each of these siddhas, had a formal education, and this is a very important element. So it does not mean that they should not study. This was part of their journey, without which they would not have gotten where they got, probably, I suppose. So.
Thank you. Yes. And if a student had submitted such a paper, I would have told them, you have to define your terms.
And I like to share like some results I gained like by looking at Indian origins of the Doha Kosum, and in particular the Mang Doha. You may remember that according to the Tibetan tradition, the Doha Kosum, they are the Dohas for the people, for the king, and for the queen. And well, I mean, I already gave up hope for the Gyalmo Doha and the Gyalpo Doha because we don't find any Indian material, and it like the authenticity of the Gyalmo Doha and the Gyalpo Doha was even questioned by Tibetan authorities. So I concentrated on the Mang Doha, on the Doha for people, and that's Daggett 2224, Peking 3068. And we have there like what I call the standard Tibetan root text, of the Mang Doha. And well, like what surprises is, well, it lacks a colophon. Now, like, let's say you cook something up, you fabricate something, at least you bother, like fabricating a colophon. So there is no colophon. That's a little bit suspicious, isn't it? I mean, well, at least they have a Gyaga Kedu and a Bu Kedu. So there is something, once a Lama from, a Nyingma Lama from Bhutan, I don't like to give you the name, he told me, please, like, can you translate this Tibetan title back into Sanskrit? So I declined doing that because obviously, you know, like he tried to make up a text. Anyway, the paracanonical transmissions, the Tibetan translation, is once credited to the Indian scholar Vajrapani and Maben Choba, and 3 times to Belpo Asu. These attributions suggest that the collection of Saraha's songs had grown to 133 verses, as it was probably transmitted, well, in Tibetan language, yeah, in the Kathmandu Valley. So the attribution to Belpo Asu raises further doubts, as Belpo Asu is said to have translated the Dohas for the queen and the Dohas for the king. 2 further Doha collections attributed to Saraha. Now, there is a commentary by Mokshakaragupta, who lived, well, it's really difficult to give the dates for Mokshakaragupta. He lived sometime between 1050 and 1202, but rather to the end of this time frame. I could identify 131 out of the 133 verses from my text, yeah. And this Tibetan commentary by the Tibetan translation of Mokshakaragupta's commentary was translated by Jayadeva and Gyalotsawa, who lived from 1186 to 1247. That doesn't fit nicely with the time frame which Nagamura gives. But on the other hand, Mokshakaragupta must be sometime between in the second half of the 11th century or even later, as he quotes the Abhayakaragupta's Vajravali. Now, on the other hand, there is no Sanskrit. We don't have a Sanskrit text of that. The text, the commentary shows Kalachakra influences. And well, what I found also a little bit suspicious is that it doesn't show any leaning to Pramana philosophy. Now, Mokshakaragupta is from Chagadala monastery, is well known as a Pramana specialist. He's the author of the Tarkabhasha, and it is not unusual that commentators quote, for example, the Pramanavartika in Tantric commentaries. See, for example, the Sekanyadesha Panchika by one of the disciples of Maitripa or Advayavatra Ramapala. And now, in other words, like, I got a little bit suspicious about this commentary, well, it's difficult to say. Anyway, it would be a nice support of the standard Tibetan root text, because most of the verses from the standard Tibetan root text are quoted in Mokshakara, or can be identified. They are not directly quoted, but just indicated in the commentary by Mokshakaragupta. Now, in any case, what I did then together with Peter Santo was we looked at Indian material and tried to find out how this text, the Mangdoha, developed. Yeah, and what I present here is the result of a long-standing cooperation with Professor Peter Santo, who is now a position at the ELTE University at Budapest. And it was when I was a visiting scholar at the All Souls College in Oxford in 2018, when I met Peter Santo and we discovered our common interest in the Indian Doha material. And what I present now is a result of our cooperation over the last 4 years. Now, the multiple recensions of Saraha's Doha collection most likely show that we are not dealing with an actual singular author, but with a literary event. That's how we decided to call it. I mean, to be sure, there can be little doubt that Saraha as a person existed, but what has reached us already from India, not just Tibet, is a version of the author made larger than life by tradition. This does not mean that the person lived in some distant past. Some scholars even think Saraha lived in the 7th century, and I think that's not necessary to put him so far back. Making a person a semi-legendary character need not take more than a generation, and indeed it can already happen during that person's lifetime. The lives and immediate afterlives of Jnanapada and Sri Mitra are telling examples. The earliest hard evidence for the author's popularity comes from around the mid-10th century. This is an attributed quotation in Bhavabhatta's Chatushpita Bandha on Chatushpita Tantra 3.4.11. The Chatushpita satellite literature also includes a sadhana in which several of Saraha's dohas are quoted. However, this does not necessarily mean that all of Saraha's verses predate the mid-10th century. Like take, for example, the verse 11, which criticizes the Buddhists for getting engaged in elucidating the nature of the fourth empowerment. And the question of a fourth empowerment got in vogue around the first half of the 11th century. So it's clear that some verses are a little bit later. And now the earliest piece of hard evidence for a Saraha Doha collection at all is the so-called Bakshi manuscript, NGMPP A2213, which bears the title, which bears the date corresponding to 1101 in the colophon, as was reported by Curtis Schaeffer in his book on Saraha, 2005. But looking at this colophon, I must caution you, there are two parts. There is an Apabhramsha portion of the compiler, Dibakara Chandra, and there is a Sanskrit passage which follows the actual colophon, and the date 1101 is in the Sanskrit passage, which was written later. That means that this Bakshi manuscript must have been written even earlier than 1101. And now the question is, how much earlier was Dibakara Chandra? And Harunaga Isaacson suggests the second half of the 11th century, and also based on Sakuma's estimate. And that would put our earliest evidence, hard evidence of a Doha collection by Saraha in the middle of the 11th century, which is pretty early. Now, the problem is that the Bakshi manuscript collection differs considerably from the other witnesses and is unfortunately fragmentary. Yeah. So still, it is worth pointing out that at least one verse is transmitted in the Tibetan root text version, which is also found in the Sankrityayana manuscript. But it's not found in the Göttingen manuscript, and the Tokyo manuscript already stops at verse 64, and it's also not found in Advaita-Vajra's commentary. So that's a very nice example for parallel, very complex, interactive developments. Yeah, we have a collection which is barely related to the corpus we are looking at, but in the later development, when extra verses appear in the Tibetan translation, all of a sudden a verse turns up from another recension. Much more research needs to be done on that. Yeah. So what we are presenting here is very preliminary. So now I'd like to give you an overview over previous scholarship on Saraha's Doha Kosha. Hari Prasad Shastri from Calcutta or was he not from Calcutta? I think he was, yeah. In 1916, published an edition and study based on a single manuscript of Advaita-Vajra's commentary brought from Kathmandu to Calcutta, now lost or not available. But we managed, there was one gap in his text, which he reported in Bengali, in modern Bengali script. And one folio of a very important part was missing. And that was on the refutation of the Buddhists. Advaita was refuting not only the Chinas and other religious denominations, but also the Buddhists. So, but you know, like we found in a collection of texts with catalogued as Sahajamnaya Panchika by the Nepal Manuscript Preservation Project, one folio, and it fitted exactly into the gap. So we had the refutation of the Buddhists in its original Sanskrit and Apabhramsha. But then, you know, like that's one thing, but what is also very nice about that is that we have now an idea of what the original manuscript looked like, what Shastri was using in his edition. Well, to be sure, this folio was not known to Shastri at all. We just discovered it by chance in another bundle of texts. So there is evidence that Shastri used another text different from the one Bakshi used, and so we have like one text from the National Archives of the Advaita commentary, and we have like what Shastri reported, and we know now that this was based, what he reports is really different from the single manuscript we have at the moment. Then we have Shahidullah's French monograph based on Shastri's edition, the Tibetan translation of Advaita's Doha Kosha Panchika, and the standard Tibetan root text, our root text. And this, well, really fascinating study, imagine that's nearly 100 years ago. And Shahidullah had a real good grasp of this language. And he also includes in his publication a grammatical overview over and also a helpful Apabhramsha Sanskrit Tibetan glossary, which contains all the words, Apabhramsha words of the root text. It's very, very helpful. And there is also an English translation published in 2007 by Pranabesh Singha Rai. Then we have what you mentioned already, Prabodh Chandra Bakshi's edition and a study, which was first published in 1935 and then republished in 1938 with some corrections. And that's based on a manuscript we still have. That's A932 by 4. And the new edition by Bakshi was accompanied by a translation of the Apabhramsha Lemmata into Sanskrit. Then Rahula Sankrityayana published his Doha Kosha study in Hindi in 1957, and it was based on a manuscript he found near Sakya in Tibet. But only the first 20% matches the Lemmata, the Pratikas of Advaita Vajra's Doha Panchika and the commentary and the text we are interested in. So for some reason, Sankrityayana forgot about the discovery he made in the 1930s, the so-called Göttingen manuscript. I will describe the Göttingen manuscript in a minute. So this material was the chief source for Bayani's study and reconstruction of the verses in 1997. It includes Sanskrit translations of the Apabhramsha Chayas and an English translation. Bayani, we find imposed his standard Apabhramsha rules, which he thinks are the right rules, but rules which the author himself may not have observed, to put it mildly. And also he did not consult the Tibetan, and after more than 25 years, I think we have a better understanding also of Tantric technical terms. Then Snellgrove, 1954, was a pioneering English translation, but it is very sparsely annotated, and we don't really know from which material he translated, Tibetan or the Apabhramsha or whatever. Then Roger Jackson's work is based on Shahidullah's reading of the Apabhramsha, and the Apabhramsha in his publication is a one-to-one reproduction or just publication of Shahidullah's. And Curtis Schäfer translated Rick Pereltri's Tibetan commentary, and the work is very good for historical study and development of the Doha corpus. And also he has some interesting results about the lifespan of Saraha, so, and also on the lives of different commentators of the material. So this is very helpful, Curtis Schäfer, 2005. Now, what we used was not unknown, it was simply not used. And what we used first is a Tokyo manuscript from the Tokyo University Library, and it's part of a multi-text manuscript. And it was probably purchased by Junjiro Takakusu in Nepal during the Kawaguchi expedition 1913. It's a very interesting, there is a very interesting travelogue on Kawaguchi traveling through Nepal and going to Kailash. And yeah, if you feel a little bit bored with your studies, just read this travelogue. You will have fun. And now, the problem is the precise number of verses of the Tokyo manuscript cannot be ascertained because folio 19 is missing, and it was just filled like with a text written by another hand. So yeah, we cannot say exactly whether this was the original text or not, but so like 64 verses is a very good guess. It could be 65 also. It's probably the only witness from India proper, which means not from Nepal, even though the manuscript was purchased in Nepal. And that's clear from the right slanting script, in the manuscript, this right slanting script can be seen in other manuscripts from 12th century Magadha. So it's unfortunately not very good, it has a lot of mistakes, and yeah, there are problems here with the manuscript. Well, there are some remarks on the particular use of language, but I think I can skip that. No, I mean, that's... So from a historical viewpoint, perhaps the most important verse is 45, which seems to have been rewritten in a Vulgate version. In this reading, the verse contains the toponym Somanatha, the famous Somanath temple in Kathiawar Peninsula in Saurashtra, now Gujarat, which was replaced by Jamuna, the river Yamuna, in the more common transmission. The reading with Somanatha is probably the more ancient one, because in what we see as a recast of the version, the meter is Mahanubhava, sorry. As this is the only time the meter occurs in the collection, it must have found its place in the witness artificially. But could this point maybe at least that some verses have Western Indian origins? And one further indication is that Saraha was preoccupied by criticizing the China, who were very prominent in this area. And also one more thing, the verse 41 points to Western India as it uses the simile of a camel. You don't have camels in Bengal. So now we come to the Göttingen manuscript. It was a manuscript photographed by Rahula Sankrithyayana during his famous trip to Tibet. And as you know, the photographs, copies of the photographs, like Sankrithyayana produced, are kept at the Niedersächsische Staats- und Universitätsbibliothek, which is a university in Germany, northern Germany. Depending on, from the south, it's north. For you, it's the south.
Yeah. But they're all blurred. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there is also one folio was it's a 10 palm leaf folio, and the 10th one is written in another hand. And it's probably the last one was lost or like not in the collection anymore. And somebody still had access to the original and copied it, but it's in a different hand. Yeah. So unfortunately, it does not match with my step theory. I mean, that would be a nice proof, you know, like, but unfortunately, it does not. Yeah, but what is a little bit strange is that the scribe of the 10th folio imitated an East Indian script. So why he did that is not clear. Yeah. So now we come to Advaita-Vajra's Doha Kosha commentary, the only Sanskrit commentary we have on on Sarahas Doha Kosha, and we heard about this text already this early afternoon, and because it does not, this manuscript does not only contain the commentary on Sarahas Doha Kosha, but also your text. So the commentary on your text is the first part of this manuscript. So it should be pointed out that right from the beginning that Shastri's pioneering said, since Shastri's pioneering work, all editions and studies of Sarahas' original text have so far relied on the lines quoted by Advaita-Vajra, yeah, as no independent witnesses have been consulted. In other words, the songs were extracted from his commentary, but fortunately, they are pretty complete in Advaita-Vajra's commentary. So this Doha Kosha Panchika was translated by Dipamkara Rakshita, and the Tibetan translator monk Bodhi was quite famous in around the circle of Atisha people. Later, it was slightly corrected and finalized by Vairocana Vajra. There are now significant differences between this Tibetan translation and the two witnesses of the version we have. Whereas one witness, we have only one folio, but they are indirectly reported by Shastri, remember, in this Bengali edition. So the safest position to assume is that at least two versions of the commentary were in circulations, but it is also possible that Tibetans added to and subtracted from the text according to principles that are unclear at present. I've never seen so many discrepancies between a Sanskrit or Indian text and its Tibetan translation. I mean, there were like 2 or 3 folios of a philosophical refutation of the Shaivas, which you simply don't find in the Tibetan. Yeah, also like the philosophical refutation of the China, also you don't find in the Tibetan translation. Other very elaborate like commentaries in Sanskrit are shortened. You know, when you have half a page of Sanskrit, you have just a single Tibetan sentence sometimes. So it's very difficult to say what happened. Yeah. Anyway, also the authorship of the text is problematic. You already mentioned deutero or pseudo.
Yeah, I do not know what to call it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we found out is that Advaita-Vajra was a common name you get when you get akshobhya empowerment. So it was a like tantric name you got, like, so there must have been quite a few Advaita-Vajras around in the 11th or the 12th century. In any case, to be sure, it's not the famous Advaita-Vajra, who also goes under the name Maitripada or Maitrigupta or simply Maitreya. Now, this is evident first and foremost from the author's language and style, but also from doctrinal positions he assumes, which are incompatible with Maitripada, with what Maitripada was well known to espouse. So one of the most significant doctrinal differences is the order of the 4 anandas, the 4 joys or blisses, and the 4 moments, which is a very tantric topic. And I'm not going to elaborate on that, but like when I was doing research on Mahamudra in the Avalokiteshvara cycle, I thought, well, the Sikha Nyadesha is a text which mentions the word Mahamudra. And then Dankomichi told me, look, there are these 8 Madhyamaka verses that's perfect for Sutra Mahamudra. But then I thought, well, you cannot start reading a text at verse number 26. You have to read the beginning. And then I read the commentary. And then, I remember when I started reading that, there was all this discussion, is Sahajananda in the 3rd position or in the 4th position? And there were many arguments backward and forward. And so that's how I stumbled into this discussion. And well, in the 11th and 12th century in India, the main issue was not Prasangika or Svatantrika. It was not Rangtong or Shentong. Well, it was whether Sahajananda is in the 3rd position or in the 4th position. That was what scholars were occupied with. Yeah. Now it means, okay, you have that Maitripada has Sahajananda in the 3rd position, and then he goes against, well, one could say Indian Tantric mainstream. Now, if an author explains Sahajananda in the 4th position, it's absolutely sure that this cannot be the same persons. So that much I want to say about it. I mean, I don't like to go into detail about what that means, what Sahajananda in the 3rd position means, but obviously it's something important. Now, the author's language is Sanskrit, but it is nowhere near classical usage, nor is it grammatical Sanskrit with a license we would grant to Buddhist authors. Instead, it is a thoroughly unique, extremely loose register of language. Of course, it could be the case that the 2 manuscripts of the commentary are extremely corrupt. They no doubt are. However, this level of corruption would be a very unusual, unlikely, unique case. Instead, we must posit that it was the author himself who wrote in a non-standard language. I'm not talking about the Apabhramsha, I'm talking about the Sanskrit now. Whether our Advayavajra broke grammatical rules on purpose or not, we cannot say. Well, there was a tendency among Buddhist tantrics to break rules, because they wanted to shatter the scholarly pride of those who cherished their Sanskrit learning. And for the non-Buddhists, it was a kind of divine language and something revealed and something, grammatical arguments were pointing at the structure of true reality and things like that. But for the Buddhists, Sanskrit, any other language, is just a conceptual construct, which is useful to communicate, but that's all. Any features of the language or any grammar, any grammatical structure does not tell you anything about true reality. Yeah. So for this reason, Buddhist tantrics used to violate one or the other rule, just to offend maybe the Brahmins, I don't know.
To offend everybody.
Offend everybody. The proud Sanskrit scholars. But that's way far beyond that. When you look at this commentary, it's really much worse. Yeah. Now, what we think is that, well, I just tell you straight away, we think it was a Neva from the Kathmandu Valley trying to write Sanskrit. That's our conclusion. And the reason is, the Advayavajra uses the adjective to mark the subject. Yeah. So, well, I mean, for you who study Tibetan, that's maybe something familiar, when you have active verbs and then you have to mark the subject with the instrumental or the adjective we call. Now, you should know that Neva is also a language which marks the subject with an adjective. So there are a few more features which point into this direction that our author like spoke Neva. He was a Neva and his mother tongue was Neva. And it shows when he writes. Yeah. So that also puts you in a very difficult position, because when you edit a Sanskrit text and you start correcting and then, hey, stop, like this is not the original text anymore. What am I doing? So you find yourself writing a new text. And then at some point, like you understand, oh, well, this author, like used grammar in a different way. And he just writes in a different way. So basically what you have to do when you edit this text, you have to learn his language. It's a weird language, but still it's systematic. And so like what we did is just we represented, this. Like, of course, we a few typos and scribal errors, this we corrected, but we didn't try to remove the adjective from all subjects. That wouldn't do justice to the situation. Yeah. So, well, sometimes, like you have situations where you do textual criticism in order to find out the archetype. Yeah. Martin Dele did that for the Namasangiti. Right? And he said, well, I really got close to the archetype, the original source, like how very close, a hype archetype. But like the archetype, the very original like text, it's just full of mistakes, So it's ridiculous Sanskrit. But later, like the ones who copied the text, they corrected, like the later versions, recensions of the text are more proper Sanskrit. But from a like philological point of view, this is a perfect situation, because you have like a corrupt text which is corrupt in a specific way, and like when this turns up again somewhere else, yeah, as a quotation or something, well then oh, it must be the old version which is copied. Then you have a date. Like it's like using radioactive markers in medicine, a little bit like that. Anyway, so in the future, maybe we can profit from this situation. Who knows? Yeah. Yeah. Now, well, I have to look at the time a little bit. I come to this like development of the text in 4 steps. Now, like this needs to be taken with a grain of caution, of course. Yeah. Because there can be parallel developments. I have given you an example just 10 minutes ago, and the situation can be more complex. But anyhow, like the first step would be the only Indian manuscript, the Tokyo manuscript, which was about 65 verses. And the 65 verses correspond in sequence with the verses like in later versions, and so also in the Tibetan standard text. So it's just like the first part, the first 65 verses of the text we are investigating. Now the second step is marked by the 2 colophon verses 90 and 91. That's 19 verses before the end of the text in Advaita Sanskrit commentary. And these 2 verses, these 2 colophon verses, are missing in the Tibetan. The Tibetans have not translated these 2 verses, and also not the commentary on them. And anyway, you can read, an investigation of the skandhas, elements, and sense fields. Objects shows that they are like water of a mirage. Within these ever newer Doha verses, nothing has been hidden. Hey, you Panditas, I apologize. Nothing has been mentally fabricated here. Do I speak about what I received as a teaching from my guru as something to be kept, complete secret? So this is a typical end of a text. And it's also very interesting that Advaita Vajra elaborates on that well, the teachings being secret doesn't mean that you're not allowed to speak, you can freely teach them. And because, like holding back this precious teaching means you have no compassion. You should share these teachings because it helps. It's a very effective way of transformation and liberation. But what makes this verses gupta or hidden is that you are not open for it. So those who don't have the karma or who are not open to understand this teaching or to receive this teaching, they simply don't understand them. So in this sense, they are kept gupta, they are kept hidden. Yeah, that's just by the way, you know, a very interesting piece of information here. Because last time I talked here about Dohas 4 years ago, you remember I was attacked by a British lady that, you know, like, oh yeah, you're not breaking any secrets by talking about this stuff. So I thought I mentioned this, you know, it's a nice rejoinder, you know. Anyway. Now, a witness for our third step would be like the Göttingen manuscript, which is nearly identical with the 110 verses in Advaita-Vajra's commentary. And now one has to say also that like the way the 4 Anandas are taught afterwards, there are 6 verses after 91 on the 4 Anandas and the 4 Kshanas. And the way they are explained, they differ from what we think was Saraha's position. So we don't know for sure, but what Saraha's position were. But if there is a verse like on which describes like the third moment and the Sahachananda in Maitripa system in Ramapala's Sekanya Desha Panchika, with a quote, with an Apabhramsha quote, and Sfera and Isaacson think that this is by Saraha. So going by that, we think that Saraha's idea on the 4 Kshanas are different from what follows verse number 91. But this is only, this is not 100% sure, but there is an indication that like after this colophon, there is something else. Yeah. Now we are at verse number 110, right? So we need another 23. Now, the standard Tibetan root text has 133 verses, and 131 out of them I could locate being indicated in Moksha Karagupta's commentary. So this is a kind of stabilized step again, like the 133 verses of the standard Tibetan root text. Now, like the Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit is problematic, and it deviates often from the Sanskrit. And well, you can always say, well, the Tibetans had a different original. That's always possible. But sometimes maybe it was also a misunderstanding. I don't want to blame, you know, the translators, but there are discrepancies. Now, like whenever there is a difference between Sanskrit and Tibetan in Advaita-Vajra's commentary translation and Tibetan translation of the Apabhramsha, the standard Tibetan root text and Moksha Karagupta always follow the Tibetan version, even when there is a fault. Even when there's a wrong understanding, they always follow the Tibetan translation. And I just, well, it's something really serious to claim, but I have to give you a few examples. You may notice that this is one of my favorite verses. I even know it by heart. Yeah, it's this. Well, eating, drinking. Well, who doesn't like that, you know? What follows?
Sleeping?
Yeah, well, I mean, now, like the full Pratika is not available from Advaita-Vajra's commentary, but from manuscript Göttingen and Tokyo. And it's also found in Sankrityayana. And Advaita-Vajra commentary supports this meaning. Yeah. And that's like eating, drinking, enjoying intercourse, summoning the assembly of adepts with plenty of alcohol, food, through this and so on and so on. Now, according to the Tibetan root text, standard Tibetan root text, according to Mokshakaragupta, we have eating, drinking, enjoying intercourse. And now, number 4, and always filling the chakras again and again instead of summoning the assembly of adepts. Now, how do we reach such a meaning? Now, we have in the Apabhramsha, Ali Bali Bahala Chaka Parasantem, Ali Bali Bahalam Chaka Purante. Yeah, they misunderstood it. Yeah, they misunderstood. They used the word king, yeah, to satiate, to translate something which in Sanskrit corresponds to the root pr or spur or spar. Like a more fitting translation would have been guk, yeah, to summon. Yeah. And Kolo Keng was thus a misinterpretation by Mokshakaragupta, which he translated as filling the chakras in the sense of doing tsalung practice. But the actual meaning is that the chakra is the circle of the disciples, yeah, and ganas are the disciples, and they are gathered. So you meet for a tsok puja, right? So that's the meaning of gana chakra. So the circle of the ganas, the disciples, yeah, the gana being a Shaiva word for disciple also. Yeah. So now, anyway, we have now in all, in the standard Tibetan root text, you have Kolo Keng. We have in Mokshakaragupta, we have Kolo Keng. So they all, they follow the mistake, if it is a mistake at all, but it's a difference and they follow the difference. Now, there's another example. We have Apabhramsha Deva vi Papchai Laka vi Disai Apanu Marii Saki Karichai. So the deity is generated and even the goal is seen. You kill yourself. What good does it do to you? So that's a little bit being critical of clearing practice. Yeah. So you visualize yourself constantly as a deity. It will kill yourself. Well, anyway, as I told you, the Dohas are very critical of traditional Buddhist forms, even Tantric forms. Yeah. And now the Tibetan has Lala Chopa Bumtak Chechur Kyang. Yeah. So also you offer the deity, one luck has been given. Yeah. And so like Laka, yeah, the sign, yeah, the sign of the deity has been seen. So Laka has been misunderstood as luck. Yeah, 100,000, 1 lakh. So obviously there was a misunderstanding, and now, again, not only the standard Tibetan root text has this, but also Mokshakaragupta explains it in this way. And this is obviously a mistake, right? So they carry over the mistake. And, it just, there are more examples. I don't know how many examples I can still give you, but they are just more than a dozen of them. Yeah. And that means, let's say the Tibetan standard root text and Mokshakaragupta's commentary was translated from a Sanskrit original into Tibetan, as indicated by a colophon and so on. It's very unlikely that different translators always make the same mistake. Yeah. So usually when you give an exam, a written exam in a class, and you find out that who copied from whom, and you give a bad mark. Yeah. So this is what we are doing here, it's now, of course, it doesn't mean that they just copied, but at least, they were looking at this material, they were looking at the Tibetan material. And so it's very difficult to draw conclusions from that. Yeah. But one thing is that I think that here in the Kathmandu Valley, you had like Indians, like Vajrapani, a disciple of Maitripa, came here in 1063, and he had many disciples here. And our pseudo Advaita was probably also like one of these disciples. He belonged to this group here in the Kathmandu Valley. And then you had Tibetans coming down from Lhasa or from Mangyul Gungtang, and so there were Tibetans in the valley, and it was a perfect situation actually for translation activities. And so but Saraha, like seen from the Kathmandu Valley, Saraha was far away somewhere. We don't know where he lived, somewhere in Bengal or maybe in Western India somewhere. And there were all these transmissions, and some of the texts, some of the Dohas were already translated. Yeah, so we had already Tibetan translations of them. So why bother translating them again? You just use already the Tibetan translation for your collection. Let's say I'm collecting all the spontaneous songs of Khenpo Trildim Gyamtso Rinpoche, and Kiki or you sent me an English translation of Khenpo's verses. Well, I just take your English translation. Why should I bother, further looking for? Because I take you serious, and I believe you that you have received this teaching from Khenpo, and well, you're a good translator. And then, I just take your English translation. So maybe, learning in the Kathmandu Valley, this is what was happening, so that, people were compiling. And now this extra 23 verses, we could trace a few of them. 7 of these verses are in the Sakya manuscript, in the Apabhramsha manuscript. So it doesn't mean that the extra verses which were added here were fabricated in the Tibetan language itself. Yeah, but they are probably originally Apabhramsha verses, but they were translated, and the compilers just used maybe the Tibetan translation. And so the compilations happen to some extent in the Tibetan language. That much I can say. And now, against this background, well, the status of the Gyalmo Doha and the Gyalpo Doha appear in a much more favorable light again, because, well, they could have been just collected also here. And well, the ones who transported these verses in Tibetan, they knew that it had Indian origins, or, they were Buddhist tantrics and scholars. They were not all just forgerers and fakes. I mean, they must have genuinely believed, that their friend or their guru received this teaching or translated this, or so it means, it doesn't look very good for Mokshakara Gupta and for the Mang Doha, but the way things developed, one could still say that it goes back to the spirit of Saraha. And in the same way, we can also maybe say that Gyalpo and Gyalmo Doha go back to the spirit of Saraha. Well, I hope you don't think I'm a heretic now or something. Especially the Kakyus, they always insist that Doha Koso is original. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Which is part of this thing. There was a movie. Yes. I would like to ask a question.
Yeah, sure.
I have been wondering about what kosher at all means, because because kosher would suggest that it's actually something that has been collected. I mean, when we think about a treasury, already like the idea of gathering stuff would suggest that it's a collection. which then by extension could mean and maybe also compilation to some extent. And then also, you know, this, what I said before, do you have the feeling that these songs, they consist of like smaller units that them by themselves would work? Because you see also all these banner lines, you know, and the same like in these shorter collections. And I really had the feeling that often you can also just take them apart. And it's the works like in the Mahamudra Padesha, for instance, no? Where you also have like the sets are rearranged all the time. I mean, do you have thoughts about such?
Yes, I fully agree with that. And you can see sometimes, you know, the units of Dohas which are closer together. And the best indication for that they are loose collection is that topics are sometimes repeated. Yeah, so you're not like refuting creation stage and then you're refuting Salung practice, and it's not like that, you know, like it every now and then you have kind of critical remark on traditional conservative tantric practice, and so it's not very well organized in a sense. Yeah, and topics are repeating. Now, that's why I think about this, somebody compiled or somebody collected. Yeah. So, and it may be by the same author, but it may be not, but who cares, you know, like, I mean, the spirit of the Dohas are similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Will you pass that over?
Mm.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
There's a, I mean, agree with all that. And there's an interesting commentary by Balboasu.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one on the King Doha and one on the People Doha. And in the one on the People Doha, he says, normally people compose the commentary based on the root text, but we do the opposite. So he's basically, because he says it's the message that needs to get across, right? So he's highlighting explicitly this fluid approach in the Dohas that you find, where, and I think that this is very similar to what happened with the troubadours in medieval Europe. Like some guy sings a song somewhere, and then somebody else takes the first three stanzas maybe, and then puts one of his own in, and then another one from another one, and it goes like that. And a lot of these Dohas, they are exactly like that. Like you can see a lot of cross references. I mean, I've translated many of them, and you can find the same thing reused. Like there's a lot of cut and paste going on there. And but this seems to be, at least according to Balboasu, that seems to be a valid approach, because he says it's ultimately always based to get the message of realization across. So it is the one who uses it as a, not just the original one, but as a pedagogical tool in maybe a different situation, in a different kind of, you know, being massaged slightly differently, depending on the audience. So there's that aspect too.
I fully agree. And we also have to remember that, you know, these authors and commentators, they were not sitting in a study with lots of texts around them. Yeah. So they were not working like we are working, but they have memorized all these verses. And so they were spontaneously combining maybe a few which they remembered from yesterday with some they have memorized a few years ago. And so, yeah.
I also wonder how much that has, how much it is a reflection of this Tibetan poetry competition culture that I was told about, but I never did any research about it, but where apparently, you know, as a form of entertainment, you have a group composing something and the others reply with a verse. Who knows whether these tantrikas also had something like a conversation in terms of songs of realization. At least some of the stories, I don't know, Milarepa meeting Parampasangya, you get the impression, yeah, that they are conversing in
verses.
song.
Yeah.
They were rapping it to each other, and then of course you pick up something and you work with it, play with it.
So all that makes our work maybe meaningless, but still it's quite interesting. And to do some kind of textual archaeology and work through different layers and look at mutual development. And at least you come to know that there is no exception to pratitya samutpada. Dependent arising also applies to the dharma itself.
I have one other question. I found it interesting that you brought up that this discussion about secrecy and transgressing secrecy was already a topic in, what was this, Advaita commentary, or what did he say?
Yeah, there is on the commentary, in Advaita's commentary on this colophon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
he mentions that. Yeah,
and
so
I was wondering how much you came across this topic.
it's just once,
Or just once, okay.
But there are other verses which are really scary, like if you disclose secrets. Like I remember, if you disclose the meaning of code words in the Vajra Tantra, you go straight to hell. So it's like keeping things secret is really essential, but here we have something to the contrary.
Yes.
Yeah. But we don't have to worry about the old code words because they have been disclosed already. They are not. They are not. So it's Snellgrove who went to hell for us. No, but we are all Vajra brothers and sisters, isn't it? So we are safe here, I think. But we are publishing this with wisdom publications, so.
Nalandabodhi says the same thing, yeah? Nalandabodhi says the same thing. If you intentionally grant sight to the book, you go straight to hell. Yeah, he says this also in the end of his verses, of his work. Yeah.
So this remark by Advaita Vajra comes as a relief, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, why not? Would be.
Lee, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh yeah, there is.
Oh. Hello, greetings from the Netherlands. My name is Jiwon Lee from Leiden University. That I wanted to ask you a question on the translating the text that you just mentioned, the Sanskrit grammar structure or whatever. It does not tell you anything about the true reality or true implication of the text. So I was wondering, as long as you can carry the true meaning, at least the closest, the meaning of what is intended to carry in the text, then is it okay to maybe slightly deviate from the orthodox grammatical structure in translating in English or whatever language?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I said is that, like, when editing a text, it's doesn't make sense to correct it, to correct standard Sanskrit grammar. Well, once you have discovered that an author is using the adjective to mark the subject, then you just leave the adjective marker. You don't correct it to standard Indian grammar. But, for us as translators, once we have understood that the author is using adjective, we are not misled by it. So we understand that what is in the adjective or in the instrumental is the subject here, even though the subject normally is not in the instrumental in Sanskrit. So by discovering the peculiar features of this text, we came to know how the author wrote, and this way I think we grasped pretty well the meaning. Yeah, so we don't have any doubts or hardly any doubts about the meaning of the text, especially since we can compare it also to the Tibetan. So we have produced a translation, and I think, like we grasp the meaning quite well. I mean, also the Apabhramsha, we could compare it to the other standalone like root texts, and somehow could also see when Advaita misunderstood the Apabhramsha verse. So to this extent, we understood the material. So we could identify like mistakes by Advaita, misunderstanding the Apabhramsha every now and then. So we are quite confident that we produced a good translation. Of course, there can be always one or the other mistake, and I don't mind standing corrected in the future. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. I also know that Dr. Peter Santo is very good at picking out those usual grammatical mistake, that happen.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, I mentioned that in the beginning that I worked together with Peter Santo on that. So like what I presented here is the result of our cooperation. So and the translation we did together. Peter Santo and I together translated this text.
That's great to know. So you just gave an example regarding the ergative marking and that specific grammatical usage that was misunderstood earlier. But I was just asking in general, it could be misunderstanding on the specific manner of grammar, but there is always a universal gap between true meaning that is to be carried, but then we speak out something different when it is spoken in human language. So translation is to convey at least the closest meaning of what is to be meant. So I just wanted to mention about that as well.
What you request me is like to first become a Buddha in order to translate the Dohas. I mean, the Dohas are like spontaneous expressions of enlightenment. And if I really want to understand truly what that means, I have to become a Buddha first. But I mean, we can grammatically like figure out what these sentences mean. And well, as a practicing Buddhist, I have some glimpses of what enlightenment might feel like or be like, but I agree, like I don't live up to this high standard.
The Lord Sowas also did not live up to that standard.
Yeah.
I mean, if you see how they, I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but as a matter of fact, if you see how they, how they mistranslate stuff sometimes, obviously, obviously wrong understandings, then of course difficult, no? Isn't it?
Well, at least we are able to correct Tibetan translations, and we are able to correct Sahajavatra's commentary on the Apabhramsha, so our understanding can't be like too bad.
Yes, I'm happy to hear you today. Okay, thank you very much.
But I should practice more and get closer to
I mean,
realize the meaning.
No, I liked your work. Thank you very much. And also, I like that you just mentioned that we are our sisters and brothers here. So yeah, thank you for your appreciations for that as well.
Well, the translators, by the way, they were also paid by page, like 84,000. Yeah, so. They were weighed in gold. Yeah, they weighed in gold. Yeah, exactly. So, like there's a temptation to translate fast.
And to add verses. No? I need another paper.
Well, translating a text like that for 84,000 is a lose-lose situation, right?
I mean, takes forever.
You just get paid for 12 folios.
Yeah.
It's better to translate the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 words. It is always copy and paste, copy and paste. The dollars are just raining down.
Maybe next question.
Okay, thank you. It was very fun to follow your textual, your forensic detective work. And in the end, you jokingly said, oh, now I may be considered a heretic, especially by the Kagyupa. But what I want to know, because I'm totally ignorant, so this is a genuine question, whether it's a literary event, as you nicely called it, or the work of a single author, if the soteriological potency is intact, let's say it that way, is there any serious objection from within the tradition to understanding pith instructions or songs of realization as being a literary event, as you call it, rather than the work of a single author? Is there any serious, I mean, if it's potent Dharma, then is it still fine? You were joking about being a heretic, or?
Well, I mean, two things I have to say. One is that when you look at Vasubandhu's Vyakya Yukti, which is a manual on how to interpret sutras, he says at some point that, well, if a statement like is in the spirit of the Buddha and it fully agrees with like the intent of the Buddha, then it is Buddha Vachana, even though it was not spoken by the historical Buddha. And I think if we go by Vasubandhu, we can say, well, if this conveys the spirit of Saraha, then like it may be a literary event by different authors, but if the spirit is by Saraha, then it doesn't make such a big difference. Yeah, that's one thing. But there are also more traditional, I don't know whether I should say that, but you know, like, some don't like this kind of textual archaeology, what we are doing. Yeah, it's not very much liked. It's a philological historical method by some very traditional Buddhists. They don't like that very much. But it's also like Christian priests also don't like the historical philological method very much when it comes to the Bible. Yeah.
Well, it's just a completely different approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Tibetan tradition does not do text critical work. I mean, there have been maybe like 3 people in the whole history who did that, and others, they don't do it because they say, okay, this text is by Saraha, period. There's no discussion. If you say it's not, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
May I? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
And the same goes for everything that's in the Cambodian temple. That's the state doctrine. But then when you look into catalog, for example, Bhutan in the country of Tengyur, he has doubts about a lot of texts, both in the country and Tengyur. And he says about some of them, I don't think it's authentic Indian work, but I put it in the collection because others have done so before me. Like there's that. So like somebody like Bhutan definitely was aware that he had doubts, right? Which, if you say that now in the Tibetan tradition, pointing to Bhutan, then that's also a problem because that's not the state doctrine. Like everything that's in the Kanjur is by the Buddha, period. Everything that's in the Tengyur is by Indian people, unless it says explicitly otherwise. There's no 2 ways about that. So text critical work like this, of course, is a completely different matter, right? Because then you question the single authorship. I mean, you know, I'm not saying one is good, one is bad. I'm just saying this is totally different worlds.
I mean, we are not excluding that it is all this is going back to a single author. It is possible that it goes back to Saraha as a historical person. Very, very possible. You know? But we cannot be sure.
I mean, if you look, for instance, at Jonah. Ah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, sir. Go.
Oh, I was just trying to add that also the like approaches within the Tibetan tradition might change over the centuries. And right now, for example, at Chechen Monastery, there are like huge projects going on of textual criticism. They do critical editions and try to like do very similar work to this one. So I think it's all a very fluid situation where authorship in single attribution or maybe in collective attributions is seen in many instances, one next to the other, without like evaluating or judging any variant of it.
I just wanted to add like one thing, maybe.
It's because of the online audience.
Yeah. With regard to what does it matter and what the Tibetans think about it, I personally believe it's a gray zone, because the people who compiled things, obviously they knew that they did it, but I think they just were approaching it in a different sense, because they must have felt that it's permitted. Yeah, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. I mean, that's in some sense self-evident. So the question is not, whether really, I mean, we cannot evaluate these practices from our standard of what authorship means. Yeah, and this is basically, this is basically somewhere where we have to little bit probably refine our idea of authorship. And with regard, but I would like to say also that Tibetans, as well as Sanskrit people, I think they were also philologically working, but in different ways, because you can see that texts have been edited, right? And then you look, for instance, at Jonangpa, who said, I have to translate the Kala Chakra again because it was done wrong the first time. So you have also these things within the tradition. The only problem is that they do not document it as we do, and therefore it is very difficult to understand what precisely was happening, because they do not leave footnotes. Yeah, this is very rare that they would say, okay, I correct this because it should fit this in this understanding or whatsoever, but it's clear that these practices were in place. So again, they had philological traditions in both India and Tibet, but they did not see the, let's say, the correction, change, and alterations of a violation of authenticity in the way that we do. So therefore, we have to refine our ideas about what that means. This is how I would personally approach it. I think it does justice to both the tradition and what we do too.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
If it's okay, I would like to change the topic. I'd like to ask the question back that you asked me about what you think spontaneity means. Yeah, you just said the doors or the
translate it into Tibetan, please.
Spontaneous expressions of enlightenment. Yeah, and before in the break, I had a discussion with Stephanie. So the idea coming maybe from a European background, from poetry, where every poem is very individual and therefore helps the reader to also experience a freshness in the experience, in their own experience. And as I said, my impression was that there was a lot of standardized vocabulary that would keep me from having this experience of freshness. And I don't know whether that is just my limited reading. And Karl, you have read and translated so many more texts. I would also be interested what you think spontaneity means, or what the function of these songs are. And maybe also if you have the same experience that if there's too much repetition of the same way of expressing things, it kind of numbs instead of perks up the mind.
I think you should sit now on the hot chair. It's not my talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Badly organized. Monkey mind, like which thing has a good idea and then forgets what it wanted. Yeah, this is hi, here I am.
Yeah. But could you please translate spontaneous expression into Tibetan? I would be really curious how you would translate it. Lundrup Yeah.
I think Lundrup doesn't mean spontaneous.
Yeah, it's
At
Sanskrit
all.
is anaboga, without
Yeah,
effort.
exactly. But like Tulji, that's more spontaneous.
Say it again.
Tulji.
Oh.
But I think, you know, what most people understand as spontaneous, which is again many understandings in, you know, let's say modern culture, is not necessarily what, you know, the Mahasiddhas understood by spontaneous. That's one thing. Like, you know, it was said before, spontaneous doesn't mean that you just say any stupid thing you want and that's spontaneous. That's not what it is. And actually, one of my teachers said the best way to prepare a talk is if preparation meets intuition, then something great can happen. But he says if you don't prepare and you just rely on whatever, you know, genius moment that comes, it probably will not come. So I think that tallies exactly with what you said, that spontaneity, or what we call spontaneity, and in that sense I would say it's effortless. Yeah. Then that is always based on some kind of preparation, not for that particular thing, but in general. And you can see this everywhere. Like if you look at prima ballerinas, for example, right? They're not born as great dancers. They have to work really, really hard to then create some impression of effortlessness. So I don't think, and that's I think it was what is meant in those Dohas, and it comes from an inner state of realization. But once you have reached that, then yes, it's spontaneous, but there's a kind of, that's the tip of the iceberg, I think. And then, as I said before, like these things were reshuffled. So it was not always necessarily that the doors were uttered spontaneously, but they were reused in different contexts by different people as a teaching tool also. And this is done today, right? Tibetan tradition too. They quote all the time. But then also, if you read the quotes or they quote from memory, then it's a little bit different. And even people like Ratnakarashanti, in some of his commentaries, he quotes things, but then he changes a line so it fits better with the point he tries to make. There's all these things, you know. So it's not cast in stone.
Well, what comes, I mean, if nobody has to say something, it's, well, I gave a lecture last semester on Buddhism and science, and so I studied quite a lot of neuroscience, and there is this gamma oscillation of the brain, and that's what you normally have when you understand something. Let's say you work on a difficult sentence and you don't simply understand it. You go for a walk in the forest and immediately, I understood. Or you work on a mathematical quotation and you don't find a solution, but all of a sudden you have it, and you have this short gamma oscillation of the brain. Now they started doing brain scans of Buddhist meditators, and it was in 2000, and when I don't know like whose brain they scanned, maybe it was Maturika's, or anyway, you know, like lots of Rinpoches got their brain scans already, and then, you know, like they were just siddhas, yeah, Tibetan siddhas, and they just go into the state of Mahamudra or Dzogchen meditation, and they did like the brain scan, and they found, well, these guys, you know, like they are in a very intensive state of gamma oscillation, and not only for a short moment, but like it stayed for a long time. And normally when you do brain scans, you don't see the graph on the oscillogram, but this time it showed even so strong it was. So the scientists, they didn't believe, they thought there's something wrong with the socket or something. They looked at the machines and they couldn't believe it, you know, that there is a guy, you know, like can just switch on this gamma oscillation and then stay there for as long as he or she wants, and then, you know, return to normal. And now like neuroscientists started to take Buddhist meditation more serious, and they did a lot of research. And Mathieu Ricard was in dialogue with Wolf Singer. Mathieu himself also could produce his gamma oscillation. So he was discussing this event then with Wolf Singer, and Wolf Singer says, well, when the brain is in this gamma oscillation, then everything becomes just very easy. And also, like, it has a function that you remember what you just found out. Normally, you find a solution to a difficult problem, and the function of the gamma oscillation period is that this solution stays in your memory. It ingrains, in your mind. And so, like, when you are in this gamma oscillation, it seems, like you have just extra computation power, or many things don't need calculation or computation anymore. Things just happen, like. So maybe this is a neurological correlate of what we were talking about. I'm sorry for this, but I find it quite interesting yet. Yeah.
But you were asking about wondering about the use of more common or known terminology in the Doha. Was that, weren't you asking about that, and like that maybe using that terminology over and over again seemed to you maybe to be run counter to the freshness of expression or something like that? Yeah. But because it seems to me that like the words are always kind of wrong and kind of right. And so, like, when it's said by an enlightened mind, then maybe like the perlocutionary effect is we can suddenly realize, the ways in which they were kind of wrong and kind of right. So, we need to keep hearing those words over and over again to get some idea of how they're wrong and right. But then, like, when uttered by a master, it's relying on something that we already know, and the freshness can maybe come. Yeah, doesn't totally need, I don't know that you need new vocabulary to express fresh insight, is what I'm trying to say.
Sorry, how could you retranslate Lundrup then in the appropriate way?
Effortlessness.
Depends what text it is. It's a Sanskrit text, just means effortless, straightforward. But if it's a Dzogchen text, it's a totally different matter altogether.
Also,
so you cannot explain it. But then most people just translate it across the board as spontaneous or whatever. Which, trust me, I think even Dzogchen is not what it means. But that's the story. But I wanted to ask to say a bit more about the use of repetition and all that. I think one crucial point about Dohas is you have to understand they're always contextual. They're not literary documents, right? They were given in a specific teacher-student situation, usually, which was unique. And so what they said worked obviously in that situation, but it may not work for somebody else in a different situation. Like there's this famous, story about Patrul Rinpoche, who had this Dzogchen student, both highly realized, but he still was missing a little last 2 inches. And so the stories, they went up one night to a meadow above Dzogchen monastery. And then Patrul Rinpoche said, "Do you hear the dogs barking down there?" And the student said, "Yes." "Do you see the stars sparkling up there?" He said, "Yes." That's it. And supposedly he attained realization. So, for me, that's a nice story, but it doesn't do anything. So it's highly contextual. So this is, I think, something crucial. One should not forget about these Dohas.
If I may add,
they don't work across the board, right? It depends. And that's also why then they are recycled and slightly rephrased in a different situation, because it's a living teaching situation. It's never the same.
Well, if I may add to that, what comes to my mind is a verse from the Lalita Vistara, the very early account of the life of the Buddha, where he said, well, I found a very profound Dharma, wonderful, but I will never be able to communicate that to anybody. I better should go to the forest and stay silent. And then he was requested, by Brahma and Indra to still teach. And then, for the remaining 45 years of his life, he tried to communicate, which is ineffable. So like, and this is the situation, and there was always a special context. Yeah, there was always a disciple or a group of disciples, and he tried to cross over his realization and put it in words so that these disciples would understand them. So that's the beginning, and like you find that principle like very much again in Dohas and like in Mahamudra and Dzogchen literature, I find, and in the koans also in East Asian Buddhism. So in other words, there is no right or wrong, you know, like a wrong, grammatically wrong sentence or a wrong word may do the job in a particular situation. Maybe precisely because it's wrong sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, you can also see from the Dohas, they use the whole array of, you know, linguistic styles and methods, right? Like that one song, you know, excerpt that said Ahu almost every second line, you know. And so, you know, I think, okay, I got it. But, you know, it's a living situation. So maybe that was some person, you know, and is basically everyone is like a wake-up call. And maybe the first one doesn't work because your mind still goes to the snooze button, and then maybe the third one does it, or the 10th one. And, you know, they're using paradox, they're using insult, they're using examples, they use anything you can think of to kind of, you know, break through somehow. And it's individual in each case. And that's also what, you know, this Balboasu said in his commentary. That was his point. That therefore it is okay to change the root text if the living teaching situation requires it.
We should dedicate the merit, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, well,
well, thanks for having organized that and having given the opportunity to speak also on behalf of my co-author, Peter Sando. And yeah, the result of our common research on the Dohas over the last 4 years is in production with Wisdom Publication. So it was sent to the production. So the book is at the present produced, and yeah, we expect that it will come out beginning of next year. Yeah. So you got first-hand info on what.
I'm not necessarily planning to write a book on it. I mean, maybe I still have a few other little things to do first. But yeah, who knows? As I said, it wasn't systematic so far. But if somebody wants to do it, I'm happy to share what I have.
Which text was this? Über welchen Text habt ihr gerade geredet?
Yeah, just the materials about.
The material, not a particular text. Yeah. Okay.
But the Padati is super fascinating. Huh? Yeah.
One last announcement. On the 11th of April, Stephanie will be talking. Sorry. So on the 11th of April, Stephanie Johnston will be talking about image literacy, meaning how to read symbolism through the painting, traditional painting, and other images. So welcome to everybody to come and attend. Oh, and on the 28th of April until the 30th, we have an international conference on Buddhism, creativity, and art, international conference. So there is a lot of people coming from everywhere, and we welcome everyone
not
to
only
attend.
from Germany.
Pardon?
I thought we managed to hide that fact.
Yeah,
Now you
I am always, I cannot keep anything secret, you know. Like watch out, don't tell me any secret.
all the spontaneous Germans, no? Doha.
That's an interesting question. Why are Germans so occupied with Saraha?
Yes,
So-
these
Yeah.
So the information about the conference will soon be out. So beware.
Good.